Hey guys, tonight we trudge through the ancient Roman streets, not on a glorious triumphal march, but on a much more somber procession. You feel the grit of the unpaved road beneath your worn sandals, the smell of wood smoke mingling with something less pleasant, a distinct, earthy odor that hints at the ever-present reality of life's end. Overhead, the Roman sun beats down, relentless, just as relentless as the grim reaper was in those days. You're not just an observer tonight. You're a Roman citizen, perhaps a humble artisan or a freedman, and you're acutely aware that statistically speaking, you probably won't survive past your 30s. Childbirth, disease, a bad cut, so many ways to punch your ticket. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself in ancient Rome, not the marble-clad city of emperors and philosophers you see in movies, but the bustling, crowded, often unsanitary reality. You live in a multi-story insula, a flimsy apartment block, where the sounds of your neighbors are as constant as the creaking of the floorboards. Life is vibrant, yes, but it's also undeniably fragile. Death isn't some distant, abstract concept discussed in hushed tones behind hospital doors. It's a constant, palpable presence, a shadow that clings to every corner of your daily existence. You see it in the pallor of a child's face, feel it in the sudden chill of a fever, hear it in the wails from a neighboring tenement. It's a part of the landscape, as common as the stray dogs scavenging in the gutters or the constant murmur of Latin from the crowds. Think about it. No antibiotics, no advanced surgery, no public sanitation systems worth the name. If you caught a common cold, it could turn into pneumonia. A scraped knee could become a deadly infection. Childbirth was a coin toss for both mother and infant. Infant mortality rates were, to put it mildly, catastrophic. Estimates suggest that perhaps half of all Roman children didn't live to see their 10th birthday. It's hard to wrap our modern minds around such pervasive loss. We're used to the illusion of control, the idea that with enough medical intervention, we can push back the inevitable. In Rome, the inevitable was always just around the corner, waiting patiently. This wasn't a society that could afford to ignore death. It was a society that had to learn to live with it, to integrate it into its very fabric. It was less a fear of the unknown and more a constant, mundane familiarity with the known. And what did this pervasive reality demand? A solution. Because, you see, in Rome, a proper burial wasn't just a matter of respect for the deceased, it was a profound social and religious imperative. To be unburied was to be condemned, not just in the eyes of your peers, but in the spiritual realm. Your spirit, it was believed, would wander restlessly, unable to find peace in the underworld. So, if your family couldn't afford a proper cremation or inhumation, if they couldn't provide the necessary rites, you were in a truly dire situation. It wasn't just about dignity. It was about ensuring the well-being of your very soul. Imagine the anxiety that must have gnawed at the working classes, the freedmen, the slaves who managed to save a few denarii. What if they died without means? What if their family couldn't scrape together enough for even a modest funeral pyre? It was a terrifying prospect, a fate worse than, well, death itself, in a way. This is where the Roman Collegia begin to subtly, almost organically, emerge from the shadows. The word collegium simply means an association, or a guild. And while many collegia were trade guilds, bakers, shoemakers, builders, a significant number were, at their heart, mutual aid societies centered around one grim, unavoidable truth: everyone dies, and someone needs to pay for the funeral. You might think of them as the ancient Roman equivalent of a very morbid, very local GoFundMe, but with much more binding agreements and a lot less internet drama. These weren't state-sponsored programs, mind you. The Roman state, while incredibly adept at building aqueducts and conquering vast swathes of land, wasn't particularly interested in providing social welfare for its lower and middle classes. If you were poor and died, that was largely your problem, or your family's. There was no Roman National Health Service with a funeral benefit. So, the people, being ingenious creatures, found their own solutions. They looked around at their neighbors, their fellow workers, their friends, and they realized that collective strength was the only way to tackle individual vulnerability. It was a practical necessity born from the harsh realities of life and death in a society with minimal social safety nets. Think of the sheer logistics involved in a Roman funeral. You needed a proper burial plot, or at least a niche in a columbarium, a multi-chambered tomb resembling a dovecot, hence the name. You needed wood for the pyre if it was a cremation, or a coffin if it was an inhumation. You needed professional mourners, musicians, perhaps even actors to mimic the deceased. You needed a procession, a feast for the attendees, and offerings to the gods. It wasn't cheap. For a working-class family, it could be financially ruinous, plunging them into debt for years. It was, in many ways, the Roman equivalent of buying a house, a huge, one-time expense that most couldn't manage on their own. So, individuals would band together. A group of freedmen, perhaps, who worked in the same workshop, or lived in the same insula, would decide to pool their resources. They'd contribute a small amount regularly, a few asses here, a sestertius there, creating a common fund. This fund would then be used to ensure that when one of their members passed away, they would receive a dignified burial, complete with all the necessary rites and ceremonies. It was a simple, elegant solution to a universal problem, born not from grand legislation but from the quiet desperation and practical solidarity of ordinary people. It was, in essence, the ancient world's most depressing subscription service. Sign up today! Get a guaranteed funeral tomorrow! These early groups were informal, unregulated. They were just people helping people. You might have a group of 10 or 20 individuals, all agreeing to look out for each other in the final act. They didn't have fancy charters or legal recognition. They had handshakes and mutual trust. They met in taverns, in private homes, in quiet corners of the forum. Their rules were simple: pay your dues, and we'll make sure you get a proper send-off. Fail to pay, and well, you might find yourself quietly dumped outside the city walls, which was considered a truly shameful end. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this reality: Roman life expectancy at birth was indeed remarkably low, often cited around 25 to 30 years, though this number is heavily skewed by high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, your chances of living longer improved significantly, but the constant threat of disease and accident remained. This stark reality meant that death was not just a theoretical endpoint but a practical, imminent concern for everyone. Now, for a quirkier tidbit, the Romans had a fascinating, almost neurotic, obsession with ghosts and spirits. An improper burial wasn't just socially embarrassing, it was believed to create a lemur, a restless, vengeful spirit that could haunt the living. Families would go to great lengths to appease these spirits, even performing annual rituals like the Lemuria festival in May, where they would throw black beans over their shoulders to ward off malevolent phantoms. So, ensuring a proper burial wasn't just about respect for the deceased. It was a very practical measure to avoid a spectral squatter problem. Imagine trying to explain that to your landlord. Sorry, I can't pay rent, I'm busy appeasing the ghost of my great-aunt who didn't get a proper cremation. This brings us to a point where historians still argue whether the primary motivation for joining these early, informal collegia was purely economic, the inability to afford a burial, or whether there was a strong social and psychological component as well, the desire for belonging, for a community that would mourn you and remember you, ensuring your legacy, however humble. Was it purely transactional, or was there a deeper human need for connection in the face of oblivion? The truth, as often happens, is likely a blend of both. You wanted a cheap funeral, sure, but you also wanted someone to actually show up. These groups, born from the dire need for dignified disposal and the inherent human desire for communal support, laid the groundwork for what would eventually become a legally recognized and highly regulated system. They were the original grassroots movements, driven by the most fundamental of human fears and hopes. Before laws, before emperors saw a need to control them, these collegia were simply neighbors helping neighbors face the inevitable, ensuring that even in death, no one was truly alone. And that, in a society perpetually teetering on the edge of high mortality, was a comforting thought indeed. You find yourself standing on a cobbled Roman street, perhaps in the bustling Subura district, where the scent of stale wine mingles with wood smoke and the distant cries of street vendors. It's a sensory overload, isn't it? The sheer press of humanity, the constant hum of life, but beneath it all, an undeniable undercurrent of fragility. Life in ancient Rome, even for the most robust among you, was a precarious affair. No matter your social standing, you were always just one bad batch of oysters, one ill-timed fever, or one collapsing tenement away from shuffling off this mortal coil. And shuffle off it you often did, with alarming regularity and a distinct lack of fanfare, unless you happened to be exceedingly wealthy. This omnipresent specter of death wasn't just a philosophical musing for the average Roman. It was a daily, practical concern. You worked hard, perhaps as a baker, a potter, a humble shopkeeper selling olives and dried figs. You scrimped and saved, trying to make ends meet, maybe even dreaming of a slightly less cramped apartment, or a new tunic. But always, in the back of your mind, gnawing at the edges of your hard-won peace, was the question, what happens when your time comes? Because here's the thing about Roman society. A proper burial wasn't just a nicety, it was an absolute, non-negotiable requirement. It wasn't merely about disposing of a body, it was about honoring the deceased, ensuring their spirit found peace in the afterlife, and maintaining the family's social standing. To be denied a proper burial, to be tossed unceremoniously into a common pit or left uncremated, was the ultimate indignity. It was a fate worse than, well, death itself, frankly. You wouldn't want your spectral self wandering the underworld without proper passage, would you? It sounds exhausting. But dignified funerals, even simple ones, cost money. There were the expenses for the pyre, the urn, perhaps a niche in a columbarium, the professional mourners, because you simply must have professional mourners, darling, it's all the rage, and the funeral feast. For Rome's elite, this was a mere trifle, an expected expenditure. For the vast majority of Rome's population, the artisans, the freedmen, the small-time merchants, the humble laborers, even slaves who managed to save a bit of their peculium, a small allowance or fund they could manage, these costs were prohibitive. One unexpected death in the family could financially cripple the survivors, plunging them into debt or even destitution. So, what do you do when a universal, deeply ingrained cultural necessity collides head-on with the cold, hard realities of economic hardship? You do what humans have always done, you band together. Long before any senator in his toga even thought about drafting a law concerning mutual aid societies, these informal burial groups began to emerge organically, like stubborn weeds pushing through cracks in the Roman pavement. They weren't born from some grand legislative vision, but from the simple, desperate necessity of people looking out for one another. Imagine a small group of neighbors in your insula, perhaps the shoemaker, the laundress, and the fellow who sells hot sausages from a cart. You know each other, you trust each other, and you share the same anxieties about the future. One evening, perhaps over a shared jug of watered-down wine, someone poses the dreaded question. What if? And from that shared vulnerability, an idea sparks. What if we each put in a few asses every month? A few coins here, a few coins there, pooling resources for that inevitable, final expense. It's a very early, very low-tech form of social insurance, isn't it? Think of it like a very, very old-school GoFundMe, but for your eventual dirt nap. And without the annoying progress bar. These early mutual aid societies were, by modern standards, incredibly informal. There were no charters, no seals, no elaborate legal documents drawn up by scribes with impressive titles. Often, the agreement was simply verbal, sealed with a handshake and the collective understanding of shared risk and shared humanity. Trust was the bedrock upon which these nascent groups were built. You knew your fellow members, you saw them in the marketplace, you heard their gossip in the baths. Their reputation was their bond. The members of these groups were primarily drawn from Rome's bustling lower and middle classes. You wouldn't find many patricians here, they had their ancestral estates and family vaults. Instead, you'd encounter freedmen and freedwomen, those who had earned or bought their freedom and were now navigating the complexities of Roman society without the safety net of inherited wealth or long-established family connections. They were often entrepreneurial, diligent, and keenly aware of the importance of social standing, even in death. You'd also find skilled artisans, the carpenters, the stonecutters, the weavers, who earned a steady, if modest, income. Even common laborers, if they could spare a few coins from their meager wages, might join. Mainstream historical fact alert *: the average life expectancy in the Roman Empire was indeed remarkably low, often cited as being in the range of 25 to 35 years, though this figure is heavily skewed by high infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, your chances of living to 50 or 60 were significantly better, but disease, accident, and warfare remained constant threats. This grim reality made the need for funeral planning not a luxury, but a pressing concern for virtually everyone. The benefits these informal groups offered were straightforward but profoundly impactful. Primarily, they guaranteed a dignified burial for any member who passed away. This might involve covering the cost of cremation or inhumation, providing a plot or niche in a shared burial ground, often just a simple field initially, and ensuring the traditional rites were observed. But it wasn't just about the money. It was also about community support. When a member died, the other members would likely attend the funeral procession, offer condolences to the bereaved family, and perhaps even contribute to the funeral feast. This communal aspect offered immense psychological comfort in a time of grief, ensuring that no one faced the finality of death entirely alone. Quirky or fringe tidbit for you *: while we often think of these groups as purely practical, many of them also had a strong religious or cultic element from their very inception. They might be dedicated to a specific deity, or hold regular feasts and gatherings in honor of the dead or a patron god. These shared religious beliefs often provided an additional layer of cohesion and purpose, transforming a simple financial arrangement into a social and spiritual community. Imagine your modern book club, but instead of discussing novels, you're discussing the proper way to appease the household gods, and also making sure everyone gets a decent send-off. Much more practical, if you asked me. These early groups operated on a principle of shared responsibility. If a member died, the pooled funds would be drawn upon. If the funds ran low, members might be asked for an additional contribution. There was no overarching legal framework dictating how much to pay, when to pay it, or what exact services must be provided. It was all negotiated within the group, based on mutual agreement and the prevailing customs of their specific community. The rules were fluid, evolving as needed, and enforced by social pressure rather than by a praetor's decree. Open scholarly debate phrase incoming * historians still debate the exact timeline of when these informal groups truly became widespread throughout the Roman world. Was it a gradual evolution over centuries, or did certain periods of economic hardship or social unrest accelerate their formation? Some scholars argue that their origins can be traced back to very early forms of professional guilds or even family-based associations, while others suggest they were a distinct innovation born from the unique pressures of the imperial period. The truth, like many things in ancient history, is likely a complex tapestry woven from many threads. What is clear, however, is that these groups were essential. They filled a gaping hole in Roman society, providing a vital social safety net for those who otherwise had none. They were self-regulating, community-driven solutions to a universal human problem. They represented the ingenious adaptability of common people, creating order and support in the face of life's most inevitable and expensive event. And critically, at this stage in their development, they operated largely beneath the radar of the Roman state. They were local, small-scale, and, for the most part, simply not deemed important enough for official scrutiny. Yet. But the Roman state, as you'll soon discover, had a rather intense relationship with any form of independent association. They liked to keep an eye on things, you see. They preferred their citizens to be organized, yes, but preferably by them, and certainly not in ways that could potentially challenge their authority or foster dissent. So, while these informal groups thrived out of necessity, their very existence, and their potential to grow, would eventually catch the vigilant eye of Roman officialdom. For now, though, they were just quiet, unassuming acts of collective kindness in a bustling, often unforgiving city. You've just begun to feel the comforting embrace of Rome's informal mutual aid, the quiet hum of shared necessity. You picture these early groups, perhaps a handful of weary laborers pulling their spare asses for a decent send-off, or a few shopkeepers ensuring no one ends up unmourned in a pauper's ditch. It all sounds so wholesome, doesn't it? So utterly benign. And yet, if you could whisper into the ear of a Roman senator or a stern-faced praetor from, say, the 2nd century BC, you'd likely be met with a suspicious squint and a lecture about the inherent dangers of assembly. Because here's the thing about the Roman state, dear listener, it wasn't exactly a fan of spontaneous social gatherings. Not unless it organized them, stamped them with official approval, and probably charged you a small fee for the privilege. You see, the Romans, for all their architectural grandeur and legal sophistication, had a deeply ingrained, almost neurotic, suspicion of any independent association. Any collegium, as they called these organized groups, that wasn't explicitly authorized by the Senate or a specific magistrate was viewed with a wary eye. Imagine a modern government, but instead of worrying about terror cells, they're equally concerned about your book club, your neighborhood watch, and yes, even your little "let's all chip in for Uncle Tiberius' funeral" society. Why this pervasive paranoia, you might wonder, as you drift deeper into the ancient city's labyrinthine alleys? Well, Rome was, for much of its Republican and early imperial history, a place of intense political rivalries, social stratification, and occasional, shall we say, enthusiastic mob action. The Senate, the ruling elite, lived in constant fear of sedition, of popular uprisings, of ambitious demagogues stirring up the plebs. And what better way to stir up the plebs than through organized groups? A collegium, even one ostensibly formed for something as innocent as shared burial expenses, could, in theory, be a front for a political faction, a secret society, a gang of disgruntled veterans, or even just a group of people who decided they didn't like the current consul's haircut. So, long before anyone even thought about regulating burial clubs with precise legal frameworks, the very idea of an unauthorized association was anathema. You could almost hear the rustle of official scrolls, the nervous scribbling of clerks, all trying to keep tabs on who was meeting whom, and for what nefarious purpose. The state's default setting was prohibit until proven absolutely, unequivocally, and boringly harmless. And even then, they'd probably still want a list of attendees, their shoe sizes, and a detailed itinerary of their funeral feast. You think your local HOA is nosy? Bless your heart. One of the earliest, and most significant, attempts by the Roman state to rein in these troublesome associations came during the turbulent late Republic. You're talking about a period of civil strife, violent political struggles, and general chaos. It was a time when ambitious strongmen like Sulla rose to power. And Sulla, bless his dictatorial heart, was not a man who appreciated independent thinking, let alone independent organizing. He came to power through force, and he intended to maintain it through absolute control. So, in 81 BC, as dictator, Sulla pushed through a series of sweeping reforms, one of which was the Lex Cornelia de Collegiis. This law was a blunt instrument, effectively dissolving most existing collegia that had not been specifically authorized by the Senate. It was a mass purge of associations, a legislative guillotine for any group that might harbor dissent or simply exist outside the state's direct purview. Imagine for a moment that your little burial club, painstakingly built up over years, suddenly found itself illegal, its funds seized, its members told to disband. It's enough to make you want to lie down right there, isn't it? The state wasn't targeting burial clubs specifically, mind you. It was a blanket ban, casting a wide net to catch any potential political agitators. The burial clubs just happened to be caught in the dragnet, collateral damage in the grand game of Roman power politics. Now, you might think such a draconian measure would stick, but this is Rome, and political winds shifted faster than a toga in a hurricane. Just a couple of decades later, in 58 BC, a rather famous, or infamous, tribune of the plebs named Publius Clodius Pulcher, a master of populist politics, decided to undo much of Sulla's work. Clodius, you see, needed popular support for his own political ambitions, And what better way to get it than to appeal to the very people Sulla had alienated? So, he passed the Lex Clodia de Collegiis. This law reinstated many of the collegia that Sulla had suppressed, particularly the lower-class ones, essentially giving legal recognition back to groups that had been operating in the shadows. This is your mainstream historical fact, by the way. The Lex Clodia was a pivotal moment, showcasing the political seesaw of state control over associations. Why would Clodius do this? Well, he wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his heart for the grieving masses. He was doing it because these reinstated collegia, with their organized memberships, could be mobilized as political gangs, as voting blocs, or as enthusiastic participants in street brawls to intimidate his opponents. So, while it looked like a win for freedom of association, it was really just a different kind of manipulation. The state's suspicion never truly vanished. It just changed hands, or rather, changed its approach to using these groups rather than simply suppressing them. This back and forth, this legislative whiplash, reveals a fascinating tension in Roman society. On one hand, you have the practical necessity of these groups for ordinary people. They filled a void that the state simply didn't, or couldn't, address. On the other hand, you have an elite deeply committed to maintaining social order and their own power, viewing any spontaneous gathering as a potential threat. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for state suppression was genuine fear of sedition or a desire for absolute control over civic life. Was it about security, or just about power? The truth, as always, is probably a messy combination of both. Imagine the quirky tidbit here: even something as seemingly innocuous as a convivium, a dinner party, if it involved too many people or happened too often, could raise an eyebrow. There were even laws about the number of guests you could invite to a dinner party. Not because they were worried about your cholesterol, but because a large gathering could, theoretically, turn into a political meeting. So, while your burial club was discussing funeral plots, some anxious Roman official might have been imagining them plotting a coup over a particularly dry piece of bread. It's enough to make you want to eat alone, isn't it? The state's attempts to control collegia weren't just about outright bans. They also involved a constant effort to monitor and regulate. Even when groups were permitted, they often faced strict requirements. You might have needed specific senatorial decrees for new foundations, or permission from a local magistrate. There were limits on meeting frequency, where they could meet, and even the topics they could discuss. Imagine your burial club needing to submit an agenda to the city prefect before every potluck. Item 3. Discussion of best grave flowers. Item 4. Vote on new treasurer. Item 5. Absolutely no discussion of Caesar's questionable hairstyle. This deep-seated suspicion meant that even the most benevolent collegia, like the burial clubs, existed in a legal gray area for a long time. They were tolerated more than truly sanctioned, often operating under the radar, hoping not to attract undue attention from the authorities. It was a bit like trying to run a bake sale in a neighborhood where the police were convinced all bake sales were fronts for illicit gambling rings. You just tried to keep your head down, sell your cookies, and hope nobody asked too many questions about your secret ingredient, which was just extra sprinkles, obviously. The state also used informers, encouraging citizens to report unauthorized gatherings. Imagine the whispers, the watchful eyes. You'd be carefully considering who you invited to your weekly meeting, not just for their financial contributions, but for their political reliability. It added an extra layer of stress to an already somber topic. Is Marcus trustworthy? He has a shifty look in his eye. Could he be a spy for the Aediles? He does ask a lot of questions about our emergency fund. This period of suspicion, of legislative ebb and flow, was crucial in shaping the future of Roman burial clubs. It taught them caution, adaptability, and the importance of flying under the radar or, conversely, finding powerful patrons who could shield them from the state's heavy hand. It's why, when formal legislation did finally come, it wasn't just about recognizing them, but about controlling them even more thoroughly. The state never truly shed its paranoia. It just became more sophisticated in how it managed its anxieties. You can practically hear the creaking of the bureaucratic machinery, slowly but surely grinding towards a more regulated future, where even death had to be officially sanctioned. You've trudged through the murky waters of state suspicion, feeling the Roman government's wary gaze on any collective gathering, a gaze that suggested they viewed spontaneous tea parties as potential revolutionary cells. And you're not wrong. For centuries, Rome had wrestled with the dual nature of associations. On one hand, people naturally grouped together for mutual aid, shared interests, or simply because they liked each other's company. On the other, the state saw these burgeoning groups, these collegia, as fertile ground for plots, riots, and general civil disobedience. It was a bit like trying to stop the tide with a colander. People kept forming clubs, because, well, people need clubs. Especially when it came to the rather inconvenient, yet utterly unavoidable, reality of death. So, you find yourself at a pivotal juncture in Roman legal history, a moment when the empire decided to shift gears from outright suppression to a more nuanced, and frankly, more bureaucratic, approach. Imagine, if you will, the Roman Senate, a room full of stern-faced men in togas, all looking rather uncomfortable with the idea of common folk organizing anything without direct supervision. They knew these informal burial groups were popping up like mushrooms after a rain shower, particularly among the lower and middle classes who couldn't afford a private mausoleum or a fancy state funeral. These groups, born of necessity, were providing a vital social safety net. But they were also, from the state's perspective, a wild, untamed phenomenon, a potential hotbed of unsanctioned assembly. Enter Augustus. Ah, Augustus. The man who brought order out of chaos, who transformed the republic into an empire, and who, with a remarkably straight face, declared he was merely restoring ancient traditions while quietly consolidating absolute power. He wasn't just building grand temples and commissioning epic poems, he was meticulously tidying up every corner of Roman life, from public morals to the legal status of your local knitting circle, if knitting circles had existed and posed a threat to imperial stability, which, let's be honest, they probably wouldn't have. It was under Augustus's steady, if slightly iron, hand that the Lex Julia de Collegiis emerged. Now, don't let the singular, Lex Julia, fool you. Roman law often came in layers, and this particular piece of legislation, or perhaps a series of interconnected decrees issued around 27 BC, in the nascent years of the Principate, aimed squarely at regulating associations. This wasn't a sudden, out-of-the-blue law. It was part of Augustus's broader legal reforms, a mainstream historical fact that underscores his commitment to restoring order and stability after decades of civil war. He understood that a strong state needed control over its populace, and that meant knowing who was meeting, where they were meeting, and crucially, why they were meeting. Before the Lex Julia, any gathering of people, especially those involving oaths or shared funds, could be viewed with suspicion, potentially even as seditious. If you wanted to form a club dedicated to, say, the appreciation of particularly dry Roman bread, you'd better hope no one in authority got the wrong idea. The Lex Julia de Collegiis changed the game. It didn't outlaw Collegia entirely. That would have been impractical, even cruel. Instead, it drew a very clear line in the sand between licit, lawful, and illicit, unlawful associations. If your club was formed for nefarious purposes, like plotting against the emperor, or even just engaging in too much boisterous political debate, you were firmly on the illicit side, and the consequences could be severe. Think swift justice, Roman style, which usually involved less talking and more unpleasantness. But here's where it gets interesting, and where the specific, boring, and rarely discussed laws about Roman burial clubs truly begin to take shape. The Lex Julia made a crucial exception. While most new collegia now required a senatorial decree or specific imperial authorization to be considered legal, a bureaucratic hurdle that would make even a modern-day permit office blush, certain types of associations were granted an easier path, or even outright exemption, provided they adhered to strict conditions. And guess who made the cut? You got it, burial clubs. These were often referred to as Collegia Funeraticia or, more tellingly, Collegia Tenerum, which literally translates to clubs of poorer people. This specific terminology, a quirky or fringe tidbit of Roman legal language, highlights the state's recognition of their essential social function. It wasn't just about charity. It was about preventing public health crises and maintaining a semblance of order in a society where death was a constant, unwelcome visitor. If the poor couldn't afford proper burials, bodies might just pile up. And nobody wants that, least of all the Roman authorities who value public hygiene, at least on paper, and certainly public order. So, the Lex Julia gave these burial clubs a legal lifeline, transforming them from informal, slightly shady gatherings into legitimate, recognized entities. But this recognition came with a very thick rulebook, a bureaucratic leash designed to ensure they stayed firmly within their lane. You see, the state wasn't suddenly feeling warm and fuzzy about communal gatherings. They were simply being pragmatic. The conditions were remarkably precise, designed to prevent any slippage into political activism or social unrest. Firstly, the club's purpose had to be strictly funerary. And they meant strictly. You could meet to discuss how to pool funds for a cremation urn, or debate the merits of a particular type of grave marker, but absolutely no discussing Caesar's latest sandal fashion, or worse, his tax policies. This was a grave matter, not a gossip session. If you were caught veering off topic into anything remotely political, your club could lose its legal standing faster than you could say, "Ave Caesar!" Secondly, meeting frequency was tightly controlled. Most burial clubs were limited to meeting only once a month. This was a deliberate measure to prevent them from becoming permanent, always-on political cells. Imagine the chaos if they met daily. You'd have more agendas than a modern corporate meeting, and probably fewer actual decisions, as everyone debated the proper amount of oil for the funeral pyre. This monthly gathering, often on the calends, the first day of the month, provided just enough interaction for administrative purposes, but not enough to foster any deep-seated revolutionary sentiment. It was the ancient Roman equivalent of a mandatory, slightly dull, monthly team meeting. Thirdly, and this is where the boring bureaucracy really sinks its teeth in, these newly recognized clubs had to be registered with the authorities. This wasn't a casual affair. You couldn't just scribble your club's name on a tablet and call it a day. The registration process likely involved submitting details about the club's purpose, its proposed bylaws, and possibly even a list of its initial members. It was like applying for a particularly dull ancient Roman business license, only instead of selling olive oil, you were selling peace of mind for the afterlife. Much less profitable, but arguably more essential. This registration gave the state a comprehensive overview of who was organizing what, where, and for what purpose, ensuring that no secret societies were operating under the guise of a funeral fund. Fourthly, while not always explicitly stated for every single club, there could be implicit or explicit restrictions on membership numbers or composition. The idea was to keep these groups manageable and transparent, preventing them from becoming too large or too influential without direct state oversight. This wasn't about exclusion for its own sake, but about maintaining a sense of control over the burgeoning network of associations. The impact of the Lex Julia de Collegiis on burial clubs was profound. It wasn't just a legal formality, it was a fundamental transformation. From operating in a legal gray area, always under the shadow of potential dissolution, these clubs now possessed legal standing. This meant they could do things that informal groups simply couldn't. They could formally acquire property, think burial plots or meeting houses, enter into contracts, receive endowments, and even sue or be sued in a court of law. This legal recognition provided a crucial layer of protection for both the club's assets and its members' contributions. Your hard-earned dues, intended for your final send-off, were now legally protected, not just held by a handshake agreement. This shift also brought a degree of standardization. While local customs and specific needs would still lead to variations in their internal rules, a topic we'll delve into later, don't you worry, the Lex Julia established a baseline of legal requirements that all recognized burial clubs had to meet. It was the groundwork upon which all the subsequent, even more specific, and yes, even more boring, laws about their finances, property, and dissolution would be built. Historians still argue whether the Lex Julia was primarily a tool for social control, designed to quash any hint of sedition, or a pragmatic recognition of societal needs that simply sought to bring order to a burgeoning social phenomenon. Perhaps it was both, a clever Roman compromise that allowed the state to maintain its authority while simultaneously providing a much-needed service to its citizens, particularly those who lacked the means for individual elaborate funerals. It was a testament to Roman pragmatism: if you can't beat M, regulate M. And in doing so, they paved the way for the intricate, bureaucratic machinery that would govern these vital social safety nets for centuries to come. So, you've navigated the initial murky waters of state suspicion and witnessed the pivotal, though perhaps not pulse-pounding, moment when the Lex Julia de Collegiis finally gave these burial clubs a nod of official recognition. You might imagine that once recognized, they simply existed. But oh, if only life, especially Roman life, were that simple. Now you plunge into the truly fascinating, and yes, still wonderfully dry, depths of their precise legal framework and the truly intricate bylaws that govern their very existence. This is where the rubber meets the Roman road, or perhaps, where the scroll meets the stylus. Imagine, if you will, the Roman Senate, perhaps debating the virtues of a new aqueduct, or maybe just what to have for dinner, when suddenly, a senator clears his throat and declares, "But what about those pesky burial clubs? We've said they're okay, but how okay? And what are they allowed to do?" This wasn't a free-for-all. The Lex Julia, while granting legitimacy, also imposed a rather sturdy legal cage around these associations. They weren't just informal gatherings of friends pooling resources for a dignified send-off. They were now, in the eyes of Roman law, collegia licita, lawful associations. This legal recognition meant they could, for the first time, act as a corporate body, a persona juridica, a fancy Latin way of saying they could own property, incur debts, sue, and be sued, much like a modern corporation or nonprofit organization. Think of it, a small group of bakers or dockworkers, united by the grim inevitability of death, suddenly had legal standing. This was a mainstream historical fact that quietly revolutionized mutual aid, giving the common person a collective voice and legal presence previously reserved for the elite or the state. It's like your neighborhood book club suddenly getting its own tax ID number and the ability to buy a small, charming bookstore. Except, for dead people. The overarching legal framework wasn't just the Lex Julia. It was a patchwork quilt of edicts, senatorial decrees, and imperial rescripts that accumulated over centuries. Each one, often addressing a specific problem or abuse, layered another thin sheet of bureaucracy onto the existing structure. It wasn't a single, elegant piece of legislation, but rather a slow, methodical accretion of rules, much like how your laundry basket mysteriously fills itself over the week, one sock at a time. The state, ever vigilant, wanted to ensure these clubs remained focused on their primary, non-threatening purpose: burying the dead. Any deviation, any hint of political assembly or illicit plotting, and the full, crushing weight of Roman law could descend. But the true heart of these clubs, the very DNA of their operation, lay within their lex collegii, their internal bylaws. These weren't just suggestions scribbled on a napkin. They were formal, often publicly displayed documents, inscribed on stone tablets or bronze plaques, detailing every conceivable aspect of the club's life. Imagine trying to get 100 Romans to agree on anything, let alone the specific wording of a legal document governing their afterlife arrangements. It must have been an absolute nightmare of parliamentary procedure, probably involving more toga-tugging than actual debate. These bylaws were meticulously crafted, often following a standard template but customized for each specific club. They began, naturally, with the club's purpose. While burial was paramount, many bylaws also specified mutual aid for members in times of sickness, assistance for widows and orphans, or even social gatherings and banquets, the Roman equivalent of a potluck, but with more wine and less Tupperware. They were, in essence, early forms of social insurance, proving that even in ancient Rome, people understood the power of collective action, especially when faced with an expensive funeral. Then came the organizational structure, the skeleton upon which the club's operations hung. Every burial club, regardless of its size or wealth, had a defined hierarchy. At the top, you typically find a board of elected officials, often called magistri or curators. Think of them as the club's executive committee, responsible for the day-to-day running of affairs. These weren't lifetime appointments. Terms were usually for 1 to 5 years, often with a special title like quinquennials for those serving a 5-year term. It was a rigorous process of elections, probably with all the backstabbing and whispered promises you'd expect from any democratic process, ancient or modern. Vote for me, and I promise your funeral urn will be extra shiny. Below the magistry, you'd find other crucial roles: the quaestors, treasurers, who handled the club's finances with what one hopes was meticulous precision, given the stakes; the scribi, secretaries, who kept the precious records of membership, dues, and disbursements; and sometimes even decuriones or honorati, honorary members or those who had served the club well, often given positions of prestige without the daily grind of administration. The bylaws meticulously detailed the duties of each officer, their powers, and the limits of their authority. It was a bureaucratic masterpiece, ensuring accountability, or at least the illusion of it. Meetings were another cornerstone of the bylaws. They specified when and where the club would convene, usually monthly, often on a specific day of the month, perhaps the calends or nones, because Romans loved their specific calendar days. The bylaws dictated quorum requirements, voting procedures, and the types of decisions that could be made by the General Assembly versus the Board of Officers. Imagine the scene: a room full of earnest Romans, perhaps warmed by braziers on a chilly evening, debating whether to approve the purchase of new funeral garlands, or to expel old Marcus for consistently missing his dues. The air would be thick with the scent of lamp oil and the murmur of serious discussion, punctuated by the occasional snoring of a member who found the financial reports a tad too soothing. And then, the internal rules, the nitty-gritty details that truly bring these organizations to life, or rather, to death. The bylaws minutely detailed membership criteria, though we'll dive deeper into that next time. The bylaws set the framework, the amount of initial entrance fees, and the regular monthly or annual dues. They specified the benefits members were entitled to: a guaranteed plot, a dignified funeral, a specific sum of money for the funeral expenses, and often memorial feasts on certain anniversaries. These weren't just vague promises, they were legally binding commitments, enshrined in stone. Furthermore, the bylaws laid out the penalties for infractions. Fail to pay your dues? You might lose your right to a funeral benefit, or at least a portion of it. Misbehave at a club meeting? You might face a fine or even expulsion. There were rules about what constituted proper conduct, how disputes between members would be resolved, and even provisions for how to handle members who moved away or died outside of Rome. It's a fascinating, quirky tidbit that some clubs even had rules about what kind of food could be served at their commemorative banquets, or specific prayers to be recited, blending legalistic precision with deeply personal traditions. One set of bylaws, for example, might specify that members must contribute a certain amount of wine to the monthly gathering, ensuring everyone had a good time, even if the topic was, well, death. A particular point of scholarly debate, even now, revolves around the extent of imperial control over these bylaws. Historians still argue whether the state merely provided a template and a framework, allowing clubs significant autonomy, or if there was a more pervasive, top-down imposition of standardized rules. Some scholars lean towards the idea that while the Lex Julia set the stage, the actual content of the bylaws was largely a reflection of local community needs and traditions, demonstrating a surprising degree of grassroots organization within a highly centralized empire. Others suggest that the need for state approval for these bylaws meant a subtle but constant pressure to conform to imperial expectations, especially concerning public order and the prevention of sedition. It's a chicken or egg question, but with more Latin and less clucking. The sheer volume and detail of these bylaws, discovered through countless inscriptions across the empire, underscore the Roman penchant for legal order. They weren't just about ensuring a proper burial, they were about creating mini-societies within the larger Roman one, governed by their own meticulous laws, mirroring the grand legal edifice of the empire itself. It's a testament to the fact that even for something as universally human as death, the Romans found a way to apply a layer of systematic, detailed, an utterly precise bureaucracy. And in their own way, these boring, rarely discussed laws ensured that even the humblest Roman could face the great unknown with a bit more certainty, knowing their final journey was legally sorted. You've navigated the murky waters of state suspicion and the welcoming embrace of the Lex Julia, which finally granted these collegia a sort of legal legitimacy. Now let's peel back another layer of this fascinatingly mundane bureaucracy and peer into the very heart of these organizations, their membership. You might imagine that anyone, desperate for a decent burial, could just waltz in and sign up. If only life, even Roman life, were that simple. You see, becoming a member of a Roman burial club wasn't quite like joining a modern-day book club, where the only requirement is a vague interest in literature and a willingness to bring a decent snack. Oh no, this was a carefully curated affair, subject to its own specific legal requirements and restrictions, dictating precisely who could access these vital services. First, let's talk about the typical demographics, because this gives you a real feel for who these clubs primarily served. While theoretically open to all citizens, the vast majority of members, and certainly the driving force behind their proliferation, were drawn from Rome's lower and middle classes. Think artisans, shopkeepers, freedmen, and even slaves. This is a mainstream historical fact that underscores the practical necessity of these clubs. For many, a dignified burial was an unattainable luxury without collective support. Imagine yourself, a freedman who has toiled for years to earn your liberty, finally free but with no family land or inherited wealth. The thought of being tossed unceremoniously into a common pit, or worse, left unburied, would have been a terrifying prospect. These clubs offered a path to a respectable send-off, a final act of dignity that even the humblest Roman craved. So, while a wealthy patrician could technically have joined, it was about as likely as them deciding to personally scrub the public latrines. They simply didn't need to. Their family and vast estates already guaranteed their eternal rest. Now, about those requirements. It wasn't just a matter of showing up with a few sesterces in your purse. Membership was predicated on a series of obligations, the most fundamental of which was, unsurprisingly, financial. You were expected to pay an initiation fee, known as an arca, and then regular monthly or annual dues, the stipes. These weren't suggestions, they were legally binding commitments. The bylaws of each club, which were often publicly displayed and had to be approved by the authorities, remember that Lex Julia, would explicitly state these figures. If you couldn't pay, you couldn't join. And if you stopped paying? Well, let's just say your afterlife might have involved a few more steps than you anticipated. No express lane to the Elysian fields for you. It's like the ultimate prepaid funeral plan, but with more potlucks and less paperwork, theoretically. This rigorous financial structure was absolutely critical, not just for the club's immediate operations, but for its long-term solvency, ensuring it could fulfill its ultimate promise, a proper burial for every member. Beyond the financial gatekeeping, there were often more subtle, yet equally binding, requirements. Many clubs expected a certain level of good character. While not always explicitly codified in broad imperial law, the specific bylaws of individual collegia often included clauses that could lead to expulsion for egregious behavior. Think about it, you're pooling resources with your neighbors for the most solemn of services. You wouldn't want to entrust your final journey to someone notoriously dishonest or disruptive, would you? This could involve a kind of informal vetting process, where existing members vouched for potential new recruits. There's even a quirky or fringe tidbit here. Some clubs had specific rules about how members died. For instance, some Collegia Funeraticia would explicitly exclude from benefits those who committed suicide, or who died a particularly ignominious death, like execution for a serious crime. The logic was often tied to the idea of a proper and honorable death, reflecting the moral values of the community. It's a fascinating glimpse into the societal judgments that even extended to the grave. Imagine trying to explain that clause to a modern insurance adjuster. Then there were the oaths. Oh, the oaths! While the exact wording varied from club to club, and specific examples are rare, the very nature of Roman legal and social compacts suggests that some form of oath-taking was a common practice upon joining. You would likely swear to uphold the club's rules, to contribute diligently to its funds, and perhaps even to maintain a certain level of decorum at its meetings and festivals. These weren't just polite promises. They were serious, binding agreements, often made in the presence of the club's patron deity, or a symbol of the club itself. Breaking an oath in Roman society was no trivial matter. It could have social, and sometimes even legal, repercussions. It was a way of reinforcing loyalty and commitment within the group, solidifying the mutual aid pact. You weren't just buying a service, you were joining a community, and that required a pledge of allegiance. What about social standing beyond the freedmen and slaves? Could women join? Absolutely. This is a particularly noteworthy aspect, as many Roman associations were exclusively male. Burial clubs, however, frequently welcomed women as full members, recognizing their need for security in death just as much as men's. You find numerous inscriptions detailing female members, often alongside their husbands or as independent individuals. This speaks to the practical, rather than purely social, function of these clubs. It wasn't about status. It was about the universal need for a dignified end. Now let's circle back to the state's lingering suspicion. While the Lex Julia granted recognition, it didn't completely erase the imperial government's paranoia about independent associations. Therefore, there were often indirect restrictions on membership, not necessarily aimed at burial clubs specifically, but at all collegia. For example, individuals deemed a threat to public order or state security would likely have been barred from joining any association, or at the very least, their membership would have been closely scrutinized. The state wanted to ensure that these gatherings remained focused on their stated purpose, mutual aid for burial, and didn't morph into political cells or revolutionary groups. So, if you were known to be a rabble-rouser, or someone with a penchant for plotting against the emperor, your application to the local burial club might have mysteriously gone missing. Imagine trying to get into a burial club today. Sorry, your credit score isn't high enough for eternal rest. And also, we notice your recent social media posts about reforming the system. That's a no-go for our peaceful repose society. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these detailed membership requirements was purely financial solvency and internal order, or if they also served as a subtle mechanism for social control, ensuring that even in death, a certain societal hierarchy or approved conduct was maintained. Was it truly about ensuring everyone got a decent burial? Or was there an underlying desire to regulate who belonged to any form of organized group? The truth, as often is the case with Roman law, probably lies somewhere in the middle, a pragmatic blend of ensuring the club's viability while keeping a watchful eye on potential dissent. The very act of outlining who could join, and the specific obligations attached to membership, underscores the meticulous and often surprisingly detailed nature of Roman administrative and legal thought. These weren't just informal gatherings. They were legally structured entities with clear boundaries and expectations, designed to manage one of life's most universal and expensive certainties, death. You couldn't just wander in. You had to qualify, commit, and contribute. And in doing so, you bought yourself not just a plot of land, but a peace of mind, knowing that when your time came, you wouldn't be forgotten. Now, imagine you've cleared the hurdle of membership. You've sworn your oaths, and you're officially a part of the Roman burial club. You might think, great! My eternal rest is secured! But dear listener, even in ancient Rome, there was no such thing as a free lunch, or indeed, a free funeral. This is where the truly thrilling details of Roman accounting come into play, the financial obligations and dues. You see, these clubs weren't just feel-good social gatherings. They were meticulously structured financial entities designed for perpetual solvency and service provision. And that, my friends, required cold, hard cash. Or rather bronze, silver, and gold. Your journey into the club's financial heart begins, typically, with an admission fee. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a substantial initial contribution, often called a sportula or admissio. Think of it as your Roman equivalent of a joining fee for a gym, except instead of a treadmill, you're securing a spot in a columbarium. This upfront payment was crucial for the club's immediate liquidity. It helped cover initial administrative costs, perhaps the purchase of a new plot of land, or even a small celebratory feast for the existing members to welcome you into the fold. Imagine the gentle clink of sesterces as you hand over your initial payment, the coins cool and heavy in your palm, a tangible commitment to your future, albeit a rather grim one. The specific amount varied wildly from club to club, depending on its prestige, the services it offered, and the economic standing of its typical members. A club for wealthy merchants might demand a hefty sum, while one for humble artisans would set a more modest, though still significant, entry barrier. But the admissio was merely the prelude. The true backbone of any Roman burial club's financial stability lay in its regular dues, most commonly known as the stips menstrua, or monthly contribution. Yes, you heard that right, monthly payments. Long before the invention of direct debits or automated transfers, Roman citizens were diligently paying their subscriptions. You'd be expected to show up, perhaps at a regular meeting, and hand over your fixed sum. Picture the scene: a small, smoky room, the air thick with the scent of lamp oil and stale wine, as members queue up to pay their dues to the club's treasurer, perhaps a stern-faced, bespectacled Roman counting out each coin with painstaking precision. This consistent income stream was absolutely vital. It funded the day-to-day operations, the maintenance of the common burial grounds, the purchase of oil for the lamps in the columbarium, the occasional feast to foster camaraderie, and most importantly, the reserve fund for inevitable funeral expenses. Without these regular payments, the club would simply cease to function, leaving its members in a rather inconvenient lurch when their time came. It's like a very morbid, ancient pension fund, but instead of retirement, it's for your eternal rest. Beyond the regular stips menstrua, members were also subject to various special assessments, or collecti. These weren't arbitrary demands. They were usually stipulated by the club's meticulously drafted bylaws, which, as we've discussed, had legal weight. Think of these as the Roman equivalent of an emergency levy from your homeowners association. Did the club need to acquire a new, larger plot of land because the existing one was nearing capacity? Collecta. Did a particularly prominent member pass away, requiring a more elaborate funeral procession than the usual budget allowed? Collecta. Was there an unexpected structural repair needed for the columbarium itself, perhaps a cracked wall or a leaky roof? You guessed it, collecta. These assessments often required a vote among the members, ensuring that the burden was shared and that major expenditures were democratically approved. This mainstream historical fact, the requirement for bylaws to stipulate conditions for special assessments and often a majority vote, highlights the surprisingly democratic and transparent, for its time, financial governance within these Roman associations. It prevented the club's leadership from simply demanding money at will. Now, what happened if you, a diligent Roman citizen, simply forgot to pay your dues? Or, heaven forbid, decided you no longer wished to contribute? The Roman burial clubs, with their inherent pragmatism, had clear, often harsh, penalties for non-payment. This is where the boring laws truly become fascinating in their specificity. Typically, bylaws would outline a grace period, perhaps a month or two. After that, warnings would be issued, sometimes followed by fines. But the ultimate consequence was expulsion, a fate worse than, well, not being buried by your club. If you were expelled, you lost all rights to the benefits you had been paying for. No funeral procession organized by your peers, no designated niche in the columbarium, no shared feast of remembrance. One quirky tidbit from the Lex Collegii Aesculapii et Hygi, the bylaws of a club from Lanivium, explicitly states that if a member dies having not paid their dues for more than 6 months, their body cannot be carried by the club's bearers, nor can they be buried in the club's columbarium. Imagine the social shame, the ignominy of your family having to scramble to find an alternative, likely far less dignified, burial solution. It was a powerful incentive to keep those sesterces flowing. The meticulousness of these financial regulations underscores the Roman obsession with order and legal structure. The club's solvency wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a legal necessity for its continued existence and recognition under the Lex Julia. These funds weren't just sitting in a pot, they were managed. Treasurers, often called quaestors or arcarii, were elected officials within the club, responsible for collecting dues, managing expenditures, and keeping detailed records. While we don't have a complete set of financial ledgers for every club, surviving inscriptions and references suggest a high degree of accountability. Historians still argue whether the financial records of these collegia were as meticulously kept as their bylaws suggest, or if practicalities often led to a bit of creative accounting, especially in smaller, less formal associations. But the ideal, at least, was one of rigorous financial oversight. Beyond the immediate fees and dues, the legal framework also allowed for clubs to receive legacies and endowments. Wealthy patrons or even long-standing members might bequeath sums of money, property, or goods to the club in their wills, further bolstering its financial health. These endowments weren't just a nice bonus. They were a significant contributor to the club's long-term sustainability, often earmarked for specific purposes like maintaining a particularly grand tomb or providing for the poor members. So, while you might think your Roman equivalent of a bank statement was dull, imagine the excitement of a new endowment arriving. It's like hitting the lottery, but for a cemetery, ensuring that the club could continue its vital work for generations. In essence, the Roman state, through its legislation and the recognition of club bylaws, ensured that these burial societies were financially robust and self-sustaining. The laws didn't dictate how much you had to pay, but they mandated the existence of clear, binding financial rules. This meant that when you joined, you understood your obligations, and the club had a predictable, legally enforceable income stream. It was all about stability, preventing fraud, and ensuring that the promise of a dignified burial wasn't just an empty one. The seemingly dull details of ancient Roman financial contributions reveal a sophisticated system designed to manage a pervasive societal need, ensuring that even in death, the Romans maintained their characteristic order and bureaucracy. You've dutifully paid your stipes menstrua, those regular monthly dues that keep the gears of the burial club grinding. You've perhaps even chipped in a little extra for a special feast, or to help a fellow member whose family was in sudden distress. But where does all that coin, all that collective financial effort go? And what does it actually buy for the club? This, my friend, is where we delve into the delightfully unglamorous, yet utterly essential, world of Roman burial club property ownership and endowments. Prepare for a deep dive into the kind of legal minutiae that probably made even the most dedicated Roman bureaucrats stifle a yawn. You see, for these Collegia Funeraticia to truly function as stable, long-term organizations, they couldn't simply exist as ephemeral gatherings of people. They needed to own things. Real things. Tangible assets that provided security and ensured their services could continue, rain or shine, through generations. This wasn't just about having a petty cash fund for the next funeral. It was about building a foundation. And the ability for these groups to legally acquire, manage, and hold property was a monumental step, transforming them from ad hoc social circles into genuine, recognized legal entities. Before the Lex Julia de Collegiis formalized things, any assets might have been held precariously by an individual member, perhaps a particularly trusted magister or quaestor. Imagine the risk. If that person died, or, heaven forbid, ran off to Gaul with the club's treasury, the whole enterprise could collapse. It was the legal recognition granted by the Lex Julia that allowed these clubs to develop a concept akin to what we'd call corporate personhood today. They became a universitas, a collective body that could own property in its own name, separate from the individual members. This was a game-changer for the common folk, granting their humble associations a legal gravitas previously reserved for the elite or the state itself. It meant the club's assets were protected, not just by trust, but by law. So, how did these clubs acquire their property? Well, it was a multifaceted approach, much like how your favorite charity might gather funds today. The most straightforward method, of course, was through the slow, steady accumulation of those aforementioned membership dues. Every stipes added to the pot, allowing the club to build up a general fund. This fund was the bread and butter, covering day-to-day expenses, immediate funeral costs, and the occasional celebratory banquet. Picture a Roman quaestor, perhaps an older freedman with a stern brow and a surprisingly good memory for numbers, meticulously tallying incoming coins on a wax tablet. You can almost hear the soft clink of sesterces as they were dropped into the club's strongbox, each one a tiny step towards solvency. Beyond the regular contributions, a significant portion of a club's wealth often came from donations and legacies. Wealthy patrons, eager to curry favor, gain social standing, or simply ensure their own magnificent burial, might bestow generous gifts upon a collegium. This could be a lump sum of cash, a piece of land, or even valuable objects. More commonly, members themselves, particularly those who had prospered, would leave specific bequests in their wills. These legata were often tied to specific conditions. "I leave 10,000 sesterces to the Collegium of the blacksmiths," a will might read, "on the condition that the interest from this sum is used to provide an annual feast in my memory, and that my niche in the columbarium is always adorned with fresh roses." It was the Roman version of a charitable trust, a way to ensure one's legacy lived on, and that the club continued to thrive. Imagine the paperwork involved in tracking all these conditions. One can almost hear the sigh of a Roman notary, hunched over a scroll, trying to decipher the precise floral arrangement requested by a deceased patron. It's enough to make you appreciate modern digital record-keeping, isn't it? With these accumulated funds, clubs could then actively purchase property. The most vital acquisition, naturally, was land for burial. This might be an area sepulchre, a plot of ground for traditional inhumation, or, more commonly for urban clubs, space for a columbarium. A columbarium was a large, often underground, structure containing rows upon rows of niches, *loculi*, where the urns of cremated members were placed. Think of it like a giant, multi-story pigeon coop for the dead, only much more solemn and usually with nicer decorative touches. Acquiring such a space was a major investment, a cornerstone of the club's ability to fulfill its primary purpose, providing a dignified final resting place. The legal statutes governing the acquisition of such plots were quite specific, ensuring clear title and preventing disputes over sacred ground, a topic we'll explore in more detail next time. But burial plots weren't the only real estate on the shopping list. Many clubs also acquired land for a scola, or clubhouse. This wasn't just a place to meet, it was the social heart of the collegium. Here, members would gather for feasts, conduct business, and socialize. Some scoli were grand affairs, with dining rooms, kitchens, and even small shrines. Others might have gardens attached, providing a serene space for contemplation or simply a pleasant setting for outdoor gatherings. These buildings and grounds represented a tangible asset, a physical manifestation of the club's stability and prosperity. Beyond real estate, the clubs owned various movable assets. Of course, there was the actual cash in the treasury, but also valuable items used for their functions, silver plate for banquets, perhaps statues of their patron deity or a revered founder, liturgical items for rituals, and even tools for maintaining their properties. Some larger clubs might even have owned slaves, though this was less common for the smaller burial societies, who often relied on freedmen or members for labor. Now, let's talk more specifically about endowments. These were distinct from general funds. An endowment was a sum of money or property given with a specific, often perpetual, purpose. It was designed to generate income, through rent or interest, that would be used to fund a particular activity or service indefinitely. For instance, an endowment might specify that the interest generated is to be used for an annual commemorative feast for a deceased benefactor, or to ensure that their tomb always has a perpetually burning lamp, a surprisingly popular request, or fresh flowers. This is where the Roman obsession with meticulous legal agreements truly shone. The conditions of an endowment were legally binding, and the club was obligated to fulfill them. If they didn't, the heirs of the benefactor could potentially sue the club, or even reclaim the endowment. It was a fascinating system of posthumous control, allowing individuals to dictate aspects of their remembrance from beyond the grave. It's almost like a Roman version of a modern trust fund, except instead of ensuring a spoiled heir's lavish lifestyle, it's ensuring your great-great-great-grandurn gets a fresh daisy every spring. The management of these assets fell primarily to the club's elected officials. The quaestor was the chief financial officer, responsible for collecting dues, managing funds, and overseeing expenditures. Other officials, like the curators, might be appointed to manage specific properties or projects. These individuals were held accountable, and evidence from inscriptions and papyri shows that detailed financial records were often kept. You find references to ledgers, receipts, and even audits. This level of bureaucratic oversight, even for relatively humble burial clubs, underscores the Roman commitment to order and accountability. It's a mainstream historical fact that many collegia had surprisingly sophisticated accounting practices, documenting every sesterce and every acquisition. However, the precise nature of the collegium's legal personhood, particularly concerning its ability to own property, remains a fascinating area of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Roman concept of universitas granted a collegium full legal personality, similar to a modern corporation, or if it was a more limited form of collective ownership, perhaps closer to a trust where the property was held for the benefit of the members rather than by an independent legal entity in the fullest sense. This nuance is important because it dictates the extent of the club's liabilities and its ability to engage in complex financial transactions. Was it truly an independent legal actor, or a sophisticated collective? The answer likely lies somewhere in between, evolving over time. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the depth of this property ownership: some clubs, particularly those with significant endowments, might even engage in minor lending activities, using surplus funds to generate interest, much like a small bank. This wasn't their primary function, of course, but it speaks to the proactive management of their assets to ensure long-term solvency. Imagine your local knitting club secretly running a microloan scheme for its members. It's that level of unexpected financial sophistication. Ultimately, all this acquisition and management of property served one core purpose: to provide security and dignity for its members in life and, crucially, in death. The Schola offered a place for community and shared identity. The burial plots and columbaria guaranteed a final resting place, a profound comfort in a society where an unburied body was a source of spiritual distress. The endowments ensured that the club could continue its vital functions, from providing funeral rites to offering social support, well into the future. It was about creating a lasting institution that could defy the individual mortality of its members. So, while the specifics of Roman property law for burial clubs might seem as dry as a desert bone, you can now appreciate the profound impact they had. These seemingly boring regulations transformed informal mutual aid groups into legally robust, financially stable organizations. They allowed ordinary Romans to pool their meager resources, acquire significant assets, and create a lasting legacy for themselves and their community. It's a testament to the remarkable legal sophistication of the Roman Empire, where even the quiet and often overlooked bureaucracy of the dead was meticulously planned and legally codified. You've navigated the labyrinthine financial obligations of Roman burial clubs, those meticulous ledgers and ever-present dues that kept the lights on, so to speak. But what were those dues for, beyond the occasional funeral feast and the administrative costs? Ah, my friend, now we arrive at the very tangible, very permanent, and often surprisingly complicated matter of securing a final resting place. You see, even in death, real estate was king. Or perhaps emperor. Imagine, if you will, the bustling, crowded streets of Rome, a city bursting at the seams with life, commerce, and, well, more life. Space was always at a premium. And just as you needed a place to live, you most certainly needed a place to not live anymore, permanently. The Roman desire for a proper burial, for a dignified transition to the afterlife, was deeply ingrained. It wasn't just about respect for the dead, it was about the peace of mind for the living, knowing their loved ones, and eventually themselves, would be properly interred and remembered. This wasn't some optional extra, it was a fundamental social contract. So, how did a burial club, a Collegium Funeraticium, actually go about acquiring the hallowed ground for its members? It wasn't as simple as popping down to the local Roman equivalent of a real estate agent and signing on the dotted papyrus. Oh no, this was ancient Rome, where land law could make even a modern property lawyer weep into their latte. The primary method, naturally, was outright purchase. A club, now a legally recognized entity thanks to the Lex Julia, could pool its members' contributions and invest in land outside the city walls. Roman law, being the intricate beast it was, had very specific procedures for transferring land ownership. You couldn't just shake hands and call it a day. For significant property like land, you typically see a formal legal act, perhaps involving mancipatio, a public ceremony with witnesses, scales, and bronze, or in your sessio, a fictional lawsuit before a magistrate. These weren't mere suggestions, they were the bedrock of legal certainty. The goal was to establish indisputable, perpetual ownership for the collegium. Think of it like buying a plot for a modern cemetery, but with more togas and less digital paperwork. The contracts would detail the size of the land, its boundaries, and crucially its intended purpose, a burial ground. Sometimes, a club might receive a donation of land. This often came from a wealthy patron, perhaps a senator or a successful merchant who wished to curry favor, secure their own burial plot within the club's prestigious grounds, or simply make a grand philanthropic gesture. These donations, while seemingly straightforward, still required careful legal documentation to ensure the transfer was legitimate and irrevocable. A gift of land for a burial club was not merely a casual handout. It was a legally binding endowment, often with conditions attached, like maintaining a specific tomb or performing annual rites in honor of the donor. It was the ancient world's version of a charitable trust, but with more emphasis on eternal remembrance than on tax breaks. Once acquired, this land wasn't just any piece of dirt. In Roman legal and religious thought, a burial ground, once consecrated, became locus religiosus, sacred ground. This is a mainstream historical fact that underpinned the entire system. Once a body was interred there, or even if the ground was simply designated for burial, it was considered inviolable. You couldn't build a house on it, you couldn't farm it, and you certainly couldn't sell it off for commercial development. This legal protection was incredibly important for burial clubs, as it ensured the permanence of their necropolis. It gave members peace of mind. Their final resting place was legally protected from encroachment or desecration. It was, in essence, a perpetual easement on the land dedicated to the dead. Try telling that to a modern developer eyeing prime real estate. But not all clubs acquired vast tracts of land. Many, especially those catering to the lower and middle classes, opted for the more practical and space-efficient solution, the columbarium. Picture a large, often subterranean or semi-subterranean structure, lined with rows upon rows of small niches, like pigeonholes, hence columbarium, from columba meaning dove. Each niche, or loculus, was designed to hold an urn containing the cremated remains of an individual. These were the Roman equivalent of a multi-story car park for the dearly departed, except, quieter. The acquisition of a columbarium, or even just a section within a larger public columbarium, involved similar legalities to land purchase, but on a more granular scale. A club might commission the construction of its own columbarium, or it might purchase a block of niches within an existing one. The contracts would specify the number of niches, their precise location, e.g., the third row from the bottom, on the left, next to the niche of Gaius, and any shared responsibilities for the structure's maintenance. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit that some columbaria even had little shelves or decorative elements for personal items, making each niche feel like a mini apartment for the deceased, complete with a tiny eternal view of, a wall. Now, let's talk about maintenance, because a burial ground, like any property, doesn't just maintain itself. The legal statutes governing burial clubs almost invariably included provisions for the upkeep of the burial plots, tombs, or columbaria. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about ensuring the dignity of the deceased and the reputation of the club. Bylaws would stipulate that a portion of the members' dues, or specific endowments, would be set aside for ongoing care. This could involve hiring caretakers, custodes sepulchrorum, funding repairs to tombs damaged by weather or time, or simply ensuring the grounds were kept clean and free from weeds. Think of it as the Roman version of a cemetery trust fund, designed for perpetual care. If only our modern HOAs were as effective at ensuring eternal peace. It was a serious responsibility, and failure to maintain the burial site could, in theory, lead to legal action or reputational damage for the club. Finally, the allocation of these precious spaces to club members. This was where the club's internal bylaws truly shone. Imagine the logistical nightmare: hundreds of members, all needing a spot. The rules for allocation were often detailed, ensuring fairness and preventing disputes. Typically, upon joining, a member would secure the right to a burial plot or a niche, rather than immediate ownership of a specific spot. The actual allocation might occur closer to the time of death, or a member might pre-select a niche and have it reserved. These allocation rules often considered family units. A member might be entitled not just to their own niche but also to one or two for a spouse, children, or even free people who remained loyal to their household. The idea was to keep families together, even in death. The legal contracts for the club's land or columbarium would often implicitly or explicitly acknowledge this right of allocation. What happened if a member fell behind on their dues, or was expelled? This is where things could get tricky. While the locus religiosus aspect made it difficult to simply remove a body, the club's bylaws might stipulate that the right to a future burial could be revoked, or that a previously allocated but still empty niche could be reassigned. One could imagine the heated arguments at a club meeting. Marcus hasn't paid his dues in 3 months. Does he really deserve that prime spot next to the emperor's cousin? It was the eternal struggle of getting people to pay their dues, even for the afterlife. Historians still argue whether the individual member truly owned their specific niche or plot, or if it was more of a perpetual right of use granted by the Collegium, with the club retaining ultimate ownership of the entire burial ground. The consensus leans towards the latter. The club owned the land, and members had a legally recognized, but conditional, right to interment there. This distinction was important for the club's stability and its ability to manage its collective property. If every member truly owned their tiny piece of the columbarium, the legal and administrative complexity would have been astronomical. Instead, the club acted as a benevolent landlord for the dead, ensuring everyone had a dignified place. The contracts governing the acquisition and maintenance of these burial plots and columbaria were not just dry legal documents. They were testaments to careful planning and foresight. They often included clauses about access rights for surviving family members to visit the tomb, provisions for memorial ceremonies, and even rules about what kind of inscriptions were allowed. The Roman state, through its legal framework, provided the certainty that these agreements would be upheld, protecting the sanctity of the burial ground and the rights of the club members. It's a testament to their administrative genius that they considered such minutiae, ensuring that even in the quiet contemplation of death, the rule of law prevailed. And so, you find yourself at the inevitable threshold, where life's final curtain falls, and the Roman bureaucracy, ever vigilant, steps in to ensure even death adheres to its meticulously crafted rules. Having secured your membership and paid your dues, you might imagine a peaceful, quiet departure. But no, my dear sleeper, even in the solemnity of grief, the Roman state, through its intricate web of laws, dictated how you were to be mourned, processed, and ultimately interred. It's a testament to their administrative zeal that even your last earthly parade was subject to a rather extensive checklist. When a member of these esteemed burial clubs, a Collegium Funeraticium, finally shuffled off this mortal coil, the immediate aftermath wasn't just about tears and lamentations. Oh no. It was about paperwork. And swift action. The club's bylaws, often drawn up with the precision of a modern-day corporate charter, would typically stipulate that the death of a member had to be reported to a designated club official, perhaps a quaestor or a curator, within a very specific time frame, sometimes as little as 24 or 48 hours. This wasn't just for record-keeping, you see. It was to trigger the activation of the club's services, ensuring that the deceased family, often reeling from grief and perhaps not flush with cash, didn't have to shoulder the entire burden of the funeral arrangements alone. It was the ancient Roman equivalent of calling your insurance provider, though with significantly more incense involved. Once the death was duly noted, the club's responsibilities would kick in, often covering the preparation of the body. This wasn't a free-for-all. there were protocols. The deceased would be washed, anointed with oils, and dressed in their best toga, or if a woman, her finest stola. Sometimes, a coin would be placed in the mouth or on the eyes, a practical obelisk for Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, ensuring a smooth passage across the river Styx. While this was more custom than strict law, the club's bylaws would often implicitly endorse or even facilitate these traditional practices, ensuring that the funeral provided was proper in the eyes of Roman society. You wouldn't want to be the club that sent a member off without their ferry fare, would you? Imagine the complaints from the afterlife. Then came the pompa funebris, the funeral procession itself. This was where the regulations truly shone, or perhaps truly constrained. The Romans, ever fond of public display, also had a deep-seated suspicion of excessive extravagance, especially among the lower classes. So, while the wealthy could afford elaborate processions with professional mourners, musicians, and even actors portraying the deceased ancestors, burial clubs often operated under stricter, legally mandated limitations. The lex sumptuaria, or sumptuary laws, though primarily aimed at curbing the excesses of the elite, had a trickle-down effect, influencing the general tone and scale of funerals. For burial clubs, this often meant specific rules on the number of musicians allowed, usually just a few flute players, *tibicines*, to set a mournful tone, rather than a full orchestra. The number of professional wailers, *prefici*, might also be capped, perhaps to prevent a mourning arms race, where families tried to outgrieve each other. You can almost hear the club president sighing, "No, Marcus, we simply cannot afford to hire that many wailers. Our budget clearly states 3, maximum." The route of the procession itself could also be subject to regulation. While the grandest funerals might wind through the forum, allowing the deceased's achievements to be publicly celebrated, a burial club's procession would typically take a more direct, dignified route to the burial ground, which, by ancient law, had to be outside the city walls. This mainstream historical fact, enshrined in the Lex 12 Tabularum from the 5th century BC, was a pragmatic measure to prevent disease and maintain public hygiene, but it also meant a sometimes lengthy trudge for the mourners. Imagine the Roman equivalent of a funeral motorcade, only everyone's on foot, slowly processing out past the city gates, the scent of funerary spices mingling with the dust of the road. Upon reaching the designated burial site, usually a columbarium or a plot owned by the club, the final rites would commence. Whether the body was to be cremated or interred was often a matter of family preference, or the deceased's prior wishes, but the club's bylaws would dictate the procedures for either. If cremation, the pyre would be prepared, and the ashes collected in an urn. If burial, the body would be placed in a niche within the columbarium, or a grave in the plot. The act of burial itself was imbued with immense legal and religious significance. A proper burial was not just a social nicety, it was believed to be essential for the deceased soul to find peace in the afterlife. Neglecting a burial was considered a grave offense, both morally and, in some cases, legally. This is where the clubs truly provided a vital service, ensuring that no member, no matter how humble, was left unburied. The regulations didn't stop at the interment. Post-funeral rituals were also often stipulated. Many clubs provided for communal meals, *Silicernia*, or memorial gatherings, *Refrigeria*, on specific anniversaries, like the deceased's birthday or the Parentalia, a Roman festival honoring ancestors. These events were not merely social, they reinforced the club's community spirit and its commitment to honoring its departed members. However, these meals, too, were subject to rules. To prevent financial drain or public scandal, bylaws would often set limits on the food and drink provided, ensuring they were modest and respectful, rather than lavish banquets. You wouldn't want the quaestor to find out you ordered extra garum for the post-funeral feast, would you? That would be a serious breach of fiscal prudence. A quirky tidbit related to these regulations is the specific rules some clubs had regarding the type of commemorative inscriptions allowed on the niches or tombs. While most allowed for names, dates, and perhaps a short eulogy, some bylaws might have prohibited overly boastful or politically charged epitaphs, reflecting the state's general unease with any form of independent public expression. Imagine trying to get your witty, but slightly subversive, epitaph past the club's board of directors. No, Gaius, here lies a man who truly understood the price of bread, unlike our esteemed emperor, is simply not appropriate for a tombstone. It violates Section 4, Subclause B, of our Funerary Decorum Guidelines. Enforcement of these regulations fell largely to the club's internal officials. The decuriones or quaestors were responsible for overseeing the funeral arrangements, ensuring funds were dispersed correctly, and that all protocols were followed. If a family attempted to deviate significantly from the prescribed rites, perhaps by trying to stage an overly grand procession beyond the club's means, or neglecting to report the death in time, the club might levy fines, or even, in extreme cases, refuse to provide the full funerary benefits. Imperial oversight, as we discussed, was always lurking in the background. While the state didn't typically micromanage individual funerals, it retained the power to sanction clubs that habitually flouted sumptuary laws or allowed their gatherings to become disorderly. The goal was always to ensure dignity and order, preventing public spectacles that might either drain family resources or, worse, serve as a cover for subversive political gatherings. Historians still argue whether the sumptuary laws related to funerals were truly effective in curbing extravagance, especially among the wealthier Collegia members, or if they were largely symbolic gestures designed to project an image of civic virtue rather than enforce strict austerity. It's hard to tell how many Romans actually stuck to the letter of the law when it came to mourning their loved ones, especially if they had a bit of extra cash to splash on a more impressive send-off. Perhaps some of the more well-heeled members found loopholes, or simply paid the fines and considered it a small price for a truly epic farewell. The bureaucratic overlay on Roman funeral rites, particularly those managed by burial clubs, underscores a fascinating aspect of Roman society: their comprehensive approach to life and death, leaving very little to chance or individual whim. From the moment of death notification to the final commemorative meal, every step was, to some extent, codified, regulated, and managed. It was a system designed to provide security and dignity, yes, but also to maintain social order and prevent any unauthorized or excessive displays. The quiet hum of administrative efficiency, even in the face of death, was simply the Roman way. You've navigated the labyrinthine bylaws, understood the peculiar membership requirements, and even grasped the intricacies of Roman burial plot acquisition. Now, as the soft glow of the oil lamp flickers, casting long, sleepy shadows across your mental scrolls, we turn our attention to perhaps the least glamorous, yet undeniably crucial, aspect of these Roman burial clubs: their dissolution. It's like discussing the terms and conditions for ending a very, very old gym membership, but with far more marble and far fewer treadmills. Just when you thought Roman law couldn't get any more thrilling, you stumble upon the rarely discussed provisions for when a collegium funeraticium simply ceased to be. Imagine, if you will, a club, perhaps one that has faithfully served its members for decades, suddenly facing an existential crisis. Perhaps a plague swept through the city, decimating its membership. Or a particularly disastrous investment in a batch of slightly too porous sarcophagi led to financial ruin. Or maybe, just maybe, everyone simply got bored with the monthly potlucks and found a new, trendier club with better gladiatorial-themed entertainment. Whatever the reason, the Roman legal system, ever thorough, had contemplated the end. The process of dissolution was, predictably, not a spontaneous, emotionally charged affair. It was, instead, a meticulously laid-out legal procedure, often requiring a formal vote by the remaining members. You picture the scene: a hushed meeting, perhaps in the very hall where countless banquets had been held, where the quinquennals and curators, the club's esteemed leaders, would gravely present the dire news. It wasn't as simple as just locking the doors and walking away, especially when property, funds, and most importantly, the solemn obligations to living members and the memory of the deceased were involved. Now, a mainstream historical fact you might not have considered: Roman law, surprisingly sophisticated for its time, recognized the concept of a universitas or persona ficta, essentially, a legal entity distinct from its individual members. Think of it like a modern corporation or nonprofit. This legal personhood meant that the club could own property, incur debts, and yes, be formally dissolved. It wasn't just a collection of individuals. It was a legally recognized body with rights and responsibilities. This concept, far from boring, was revolutionary, laying groundwork for much of our modern corporate law. Without it, a dissolving club would have been a chaotic free-for-all, rather than a structured wind-down. So, how did this legal entity, this persona ficta, actually dissolve? The most common trigger for dissolution was a decision by the members themselves, often due to a significant decline in membership, or a prolonged period of financial distress. If the club simply couldn't attract new members, or if existing members stopped paying their dues, a common problem, even then, I assure you, the financial well-being of the Collegium would inevitably suffer. You can almost hear the sighs of the treasurer, reviewing the dwindling coffers. Another, less voluntary, reason for dissolution could be an imperial decree. While we'll delve deeper into imperial oversight in the next section, suffice it to say that if a burial club was deemed to have deviated from its stated purpose, engaged in seditious activities, or simply grown too large and influential for the state's comfort, it could be forcibly disbanded. Imagine receiving a stern letter from the emperor's office, informing you that your beloved, happy-go-lucky burial society of Rome was no more. Suddenly, all those carefully planned funeral arrangements would be up in smoke, or rather, up in the Roman equivalent of a very stern legal brief. Once the decision to dissolve was made, or mandated, the real fun began, the distribution of assets and the fulfillment of obligations. This is where the dry, dusty scrolls of Roman legal texts truly shine, outlining procedures that would make even a modern bankruptcy lawyer nod in appreciation. The first priority, always, was to settle any outstanding debts. Just like today, creditors came first. If the club owed money for the upkeep of its columbarium, for a recent purchase of funeral wreaths, or even for the catering at the last communal banquet, because, naturally, even a dissolving club had to settle its accounts, those debts had to be paid before anything else. After the creditors were satisfied, the remaining assets, which could include anything from cash reserves, valuable silver vessels used for ceremonies, or even the land and structures of the columbarium itself, had to be distributed. This is where things could get genuinely complex. Were the assets returned proportionally to the members based on their contributions? Or were they given to a successor entity? This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit about Roman burial club dissolution. Some clubs, particularly those facing financial hardship but not outright ruin, would attempt to merge with more solvent clubs rather than completely dissolve. You can almost picture the ancient Roman equivalent of corporate merger negotiations, two sets of curators meeting, perhaps over a goblet of watered-down wine, haggling over shared assets, liabilities, and most importantly, the transfer of existing funeral obligations. Yes, we'll take on your 50 remaining members, but only if you throw in that rather fetching marble bust of your founder. These mergers often required careful legal agreements to ensure that the rights of members from both original clubs were protected, especially their guaranteed burial rights. It was a pragmatic solution, a way to ensure continuity of service when one club faltered. The core obligation of any burial club was, of course, to provide dignified burials for its members. So, what happened to this sacred promise when a club dissolved? The law was clear. The obligations had to be met. If the club had sufficient funds after paying its debts, it might set aside a sum specifically for the future burials of its living members, perhaps entrusting it to a reliable individual, or another collegium willing to take on the responsibility. Alternatively, if a merger occurred, the successor club would typically assume these obligations. It wasn't just about money, it was about the peace of mind of the members, knowing their final resting place was secured. Imagine the distress if, after years of dutiful payments, you suddenly found your club dissolved and your future funeral arrangements in limbo. The Roman legal system aimed to prevent such anxieties. However, historians still argue whether the primary trigger for dissolution was typically financial insolvency, dwindling membership, or direct imperial intervention. While all three were possibilities, the precise frequency and the dominant cause remained subjects of scholarly debate. For instance, were there common legal loopholes that allowed clubs to shirk their final obligations, or was the system generally robust in protecting members? The surviving inscriptions and legal texts offer tantalizing clues, but a definitive, universally agreed upon answer remains elusive. It's a bit like trying to figure out why your favorite coffee shop closed down. Was it the rent, the lack of customers, or just the owner's sudden decision to become a goat farmer? Let's consider the property ownership aspect again. If a club owned its columbarium, or land for burial plots, this property was a significant asset. Upon dissolution, this property could be sold, with the proceeds distributed, or it could be transferred to another collegium or even a religious institution. The legal instruments for these transfers were formal contracts, often witnessed and recorded, ensuring the legitimacy of the transaction. You can only imagine the toga-clad accountants poring over ledgers, trying to figure out if that last marble urn was an asset or a liability, depending on whether it was empty or, well, occupied. The concept of hereditas iacens, an inheritance that has not yet been accepted by an heir, and thus is considered lying vacant, could, in some convoluted legal interpretations, apply to the assets of a defunct club before their final distribution. It's a dry term for a potentially chaotic situation, where assets might temporarily exist in a legal no man's land. But the Roman legal system, ever keen on order, generally had mechanisms to ensure that such assets were eventually settled, either through a designated liquidator or by being claimed by the state if no legitimate claimant emerged. In essence, the Roman approach to the dissolution of burial clubs was a testament to their legal sophistication. It wasn't about vengeance or punishment, but about orderly transition and the fulfillment of contractual obligations, even in the face of an organization's demise. They understood that these clubs, while serving a private need, also played a crucial role in maintaining social order and providing peace of mind to a significant portion of the population. So, even in their winding down, these seemingly boring bureaucratic entities continued to reflect the pragmatic genius of Roman law. It's enough to make you wish you just buried your loved ones in the backyard, legally dubious though that might have been, just to avoid all the paperwork. But then, who would have provided the post-funeral banquet? You've navigated the intricate legal mazes of membership, funds, and even the very dirt where Roman burial club members would eventually rest. Now, as the Roman sun begins its slow, inevitable descent, casting long shadows across the forum, we turn our gaze to a rather less comforting aspect of these seemingly benign societies: the ever-watchful eye of the Roman state. You see, even if you were just trying to ensure your friends got a proper send-off, the empire was always peering over your shoulder, ready to tap you with a stern finger if you stepped out of line. This is where the truly boring laws become truly fascinating, because they reveal the deep-seated Roman paranoia about any organized group that wasn't explicitly under state control. Imagine, if you will, being a diligent quinquenales of your local burial club, carefully balancing the books, ensuring the oil lamps were stocked for the next funeral vigil. You'd think your biggest worry would be a sudden spike in membership deaths or a particularly extravagant request for a funeral feast. But no, lurking in the bureaucratic shadows was the specter of imperial oversight. The Roman state, with its vast administrative apparatus, wasn't content to simply permit these clubs. It sought to control them, to ensure they remained focused solely on their funerary purpose and didn't, say, morph into a political faction or, heaven forbid, a secret society for discussing the merits of a new emperor. It was like your overly protective parent who lets you have a sleepover, but then calls every hour to make sure you're just watching movies and not, planning a coup against the household chores. The primary mechanism for this oversight began, as so many things did in Rome, with registration. After the Lex Julia de Collegiis, as we touched upon earlier, a burial club wasn't just a friendly gathering, it was a legal entity. And legal entities required official recognition. You couldn't just hang a shingle outside your meeting hall declaring yourselves the Benevolent Society of the Peaceful Repose. Oh no. You had to go through the proper channels, submitting your bylaws, your membership lists, and likely a hefty fee, to the appropriate imperial authority. This wasn't merely a formality, it was a vetting process. The officials, often a city prefect or a provincial governor, would scrutinize your application. Were your stated aims purely funerary? Was there any whiff of political ambition? Any hint of a cult not sanctioned by Rome? If anything seemed amiss, your application could be denied, leaving your hopeful members without their promised plot of land or a decent funeral pyre. It was the ancient equivalent of needing a permit for absolutely everything, right down to organizing a bake sale, except the bake sale could lead to sedition. Once recognized, the oversight didn't magically disappear. These clubs were expected to adhere strictly to their registered bylaws. Any deviation, any unauthorized expansion of activities, could be grounds for intervention. Imagine the dry rustle of papyrus as an imperial clerk reviews quarterly reports, looking for anomalies. Here we see the Club of the Eternal Sleepers purchased an unusually large quantity of purple dye last month. Are they truly honoring the deceased, or are they perhaps subtly manufacturing imperial cloaks for a clandestine revolutionary movement? Okay, perhaps that's a slight exaggeration, but the suspicion was real. The state wanted to ensure that the Collegia Tenurum, the clubs of the poorer classes, remained just that, poor, and focused on death, not life and certainly not politics. One mainstream historical fact to underscore this is the general Roman distrust of collegia in the late Republic and early Empire. Before Augustus, many associations, even seemingly innocuous ones, were seen as potential hotbeds of political dissent or even outright mob violence. Think of Clodius Pulcher and his gangs, which were often organized under the guise of various collegia. Augustus, in his quest for stability, cracked down hard, dissolving many existing associations and requiring strict imperial approval for new ones. Burial clubs were granted a specific exemption due to their undeniable social utility, but this exemption came with a very long leash of imperial control attached. It was a grudging tolerance, not an enthusiastic endorsement. Now, what happened if you stepped out of line? The sanctions could range from mild to devastating. At the lighter end, you might face an official warning, a demand to amend your bylaws, or a fine. Picture a stern-faced aedile or a representative of the city prefect arriving at your meeting, perhaps during your annual feast, just as you're about to carve the sacrificial pig. He wouldn't confiscate your pork, thankfully, but he might deliver a chilling decree, reminding you that your club's very existence was a privilege, not a right. It was the Roman equivalent of getting a strongly worded letter from the IRS, except the IRS could also dissolve your entire organization. More severe sanctions included the seizure of club assets. If your club was deemed to be operating outside its legal mandate, or worse, engaged in activities detrimental to public order, the state could simply confiscate your shared property, the land for the columbarium, the funds in the treasury, even the modest meeting hall. Imagine the horror, all those years of careful contributions, all that collective effort to secure a dignified resting place, suddenly gone, absorbed into the imperial coffers. It was a powerful disincentive to any club contemplating a foray into, say, illegal gambling or, more seriously, seditious speech. And then, the ultimate sanction, dissolution. This was the state's trump card, the bureaucratic equivalent of hitting the nuclear button. If a burial club was deemed unlawful or rebellious, it could be summarily disbanded. What constituted unlawful? Any significant deviation from its registered purpose, any violation of public order, or engaging in activities that weren't explicitly funerary. What constituted rebellious? This was the truly chilling part. It could be anything from organizing a protest against a local magistrate to secretly harboring followers of an unsanctioned cult. The definition was deliberately broad, leaving ample room for interpretation by imperial authorities. A quirky or fringe tidbit here: there are records, albeit sparse, of informers, *delators*, playing a role in this oversight. While not always directly tied to burial clubs, the Roman system encouraged citizens to report perceived transgressions, often for a reward. So, if your club treasurer had a grudge against the quinquennales, or if a disgruntled former member felt slighted, they might whisper suspicions to the authorities. Oh, the friends of the quiet grave? I heard them discussing something other than funeral arrangements at their last meeting. Something about the price of grain and the emperor's new beard. Such reports, however flimsy, could trigger an official investigation, forcing the club to prove its innocence, which, as anyone who has dealt with bureaucracy knows, is often harder than proving guilt. Historians still argue whether the imperial oversight of burial clubs was primarily a pragmatic measure to maintain public order and prevent fraud, or if it was a more insidious tool of social control, designed to keep the lower classes docile and atomized. Was it a benevolent hand ensuring proper burials, or a heavy fist suppressing any nascent collective power? It's a fascinating debate, as the evidence often points to both interpretations depending on the specific context and the emperor in power. Augustus was certainly more stringent than, say, a later emperor who might have been more concerned with border skirmishes than the minutiae of burial club bylaws. The process of disbandment itself was grimly efficient. Once the decree was issued, the club ceased to exist as a legal entity. Its property would be confiscated, its members left without the benefits they had paid into for years. There might be a public announcement, perhaps a notice posted in the forum, declaring the club null and void. For the members, it was a profound personal loss, not just of financial investment but of community, and the promise of a dignified end. Imagine saving up for decades, contributing your hard-earned denarii, only for the government to swoop in and declare your entire mutual aid society illegal because someone, somewhere, thought your annual picnic was too boisterous. It's enough to make you just want to be thrown into a ditch, isn't it? Almost. The Roman state, through its various officials, governors, city prefects, even local magistrates, exercised this power. They had the authority to demand records, conduct investigations, and issue judgments. There wasn't a dedicated burial club police force, per se, but rather this responsibility fell under the broader umbrella of maintaining public order and overseeing legal entities. It was part of the everyday grind of Roman governance, a testament to the fact that no detail, however seemingly mundane, escaped the attention of an empire obsessed with order. They weren't just building aqueducts and conquering barbarians. They were making sure your funeral club wasn't secretly plotting to overthrow the local garum factory. This level of imperial control, while sometimes burdensome, also lent a certain legitimacy to the burial clubs that were recognized. If your club had the imperial stamp of approval, it meant something. It meant your contracts were legally binding, your property rights were protected, as long as you behaved, and your members could have a reasonable expectation of receiving the promised services. It was a double-edged sword. The state could take it all away, but it also underpinned the legal framework that allowed these clubs to flourish in the first place. You got the stability of the Pax Romana, but you also got the paperwork of the Pax Romana. Every silver lining has a cloud, and every Roman legal exemption had a bureaucrat standing by with a quill pen and a suspicious frown. So, as you drift off, perhaps contemplating the vast, intricate web of Roman law, remember that even in death, the long arm of the empire reached out. It wasn't just about grand legions or magnificent emperors. It was about the meticulous, often tedious, administration of everyday life, right down to how a group of ordinary Romans could band together to ensure a proper burial. The bureaucracy, as boring as it might seem, was the very sinew of the Roman state, ensuring that even the most somber of associations remained firmly within the confines of imperial authority. Now, as you gently drift deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of Roman law, you might be tempted to think that the rules we've discussed so far, these intricate bylaws and precise financial obligations for burial clubs, applied uniformly across the entire sprawling Roman Empire. If only life, or indeed death, were so neatly organized. You see, the Romans, for all their love of order and straight roads, were also remarkably pragmatic. They understood that an empire the size of theirs, stretching from the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, couldn't be governed by a single, unyielding legal hammer. No, that would be like trying to fit a square peg into 1,000 different shaped holes, each with its own local traditions and eccentricities. So, as the empire expanded, Roman law itself had to perform a delicate dance, a legal ballet if you will, between imposing its core principles and gracefully adapting to local customs. This adaptability was, in fact, one of the unsung heroes of Rome's enduring power, a mainstream historical fact often overlooked in favor of legions and emperors. It's like a sophisticated operating system that can run on various hardware configurations, from a clunky old desktop in Gaul to a sleek, papyrus-powered tablet in Alexandria. Let's journey first to the lush, fertile lands of Roman Egypt, a province with a history stretching back millennia before Rome even dreamt of 7 hills. Here, you'd find burial clubs, certainly, but they operated under a fascinating blend of Roman legal principles and deeply ingrained Egyptian traditions. For instance, while Roman law might dictate the need for formal registration with a local magistrate, the spirit of the club's activities often leaned heavily on ancient funerary cults and a preoccupation with the afterlife that was far more pronounced than in Rome itself. You might find a club's bylaws stipulating not just the provision of a burial plot, but also the continued offering of libations or food to the deceased's tomb, a practice rooted in pharaonic beliefs about sustaining the ka, life force, and ba, soul, in the afterlife. Imagine the monthly meeting. Right, who's bringing the bread and beer for old Tiberius this week? And remember, the sacred oils for Auntie Cleopatra's eternal slumber are due by the Ides. It adds a whole new layer to dues, doesn't it? In some Egyptian burial clubs, there was even a quirky tidbit. Members might contribute not just money, but also specific funerary goods or services, like linen for wrapping, or even a commitment to help with the mummification process, a craft that Roman law certainly didn't have a standardized regulation for. The legal framework would acknowledge the value of these contributions, even if the specific practice was alien to Roman mores. The local Roman governor, while ensuring public order and tax collection, probably just scratched his head and approved the bylaws as long as they didn't involve anything too scandalous or rebellious. As long as they're not plotting against me. You can almost hear him sigh. They can embalm each other with honey if they wish. Then, you float across the shimmering Mediterranean to the Greek East, where cities like Ephesus, Corinth, and Antioch had their own long-standing traditions of associations, or Thyessa and Arena. These weren't just burial clubs. They were often philosophical societies, religious cults, or professional guilds that also happened to provide funerary benefits. When Roman law arrived, it didn't obliterate these structures but rather sought to integrate them. The Lex Julia de Collegiis, which we discussed earlier, provided a template, but local magistrates in the Greek cities often had more leeway in interpreting its application. For example, the requirements for membership might be more flexible, embracing a wider range of social classes or even allowing slaves to join more readily, especially if the club was tied to a specific mystery cult that emphasized spiritual equality. You'd also find variations in how property was held. In some Greek cities, communal property was a more ingrained concept than in Roman law, so a burial club might own land or buildings in a slightly different legal manner, perhaps more akin to a public trust or a temple precinct. Historians still argue whether these adaptations were a true absorption of local legal concepts into Roman law, or merely a pragmatic tolerance of existing practices that didn't fundamentally challenge Roman imperial authority. It's a bit like trying to decide if your smart speaker truly understands your regional accent, or if it's just doing a really good job of faking it. Now let's turn our gaze westward, to the rugged, less urbanized provinces of Gaul and Britannia. Here, the challenge wasn't just integrating with ancient, sophisticated legal traditions, but often establishing a legal framework where none had formally existed in the Roman sense. Burial clubs in these regions might have been simpler, more akin to informal village cooperatives. The concept of a formal, registered collegium, with its detailed bylaws and financial records, might have been a relatively new imposition. You wouldn't find the elaborate columbaria of Rome or the grand funerary monuments of Egypt. Instead, a club might simply own a communal plot of land, perhaps marked by a few humble stelae, and the emphasis would be on collective labor for digging graves and organizing the final rites. The statutes governing these clubs might have been less detailed, relying more on custom and oral agreements, which would then be loosely interpreted through the lens of Roman administrative directives. Imagine a Roman official trying to explain the intricacies of res mancipi and res nec mancipi to a Gallic farmer who just wants to make sure his family gets a decent send-off. So you're telling me this cow is mancipi, but this plot of land for burying my ancestors is nec mancipi? And which one needs a formal witness and bronze scales again? It's enough to make you want to just dig a hole and be done with it. The oversight in these areas might also have been less direct, with local chieftains or Roman military commanders playing a more significant role in arbitration than trained civilian magistrates. In North Africa, particularly in provinces like Mauritania and Numidia, you encounter another fascinating blend. Here, Punic influences from Carthage were still strong, and local religious practices, sometimes involving complex funerary rituals and specific deities of the underworld, often intertwined with Roman pietas. Burial clubs might be dedicated to a local god or goddess, and their legal standing could be tied to their religious identity. The Roman authorities, ever pragmatic, often allowed these religious aspects to flourish, as long as they didn't incite sedition or conflict with the imperial cult. You might find regulations stipulating specific offerings to local deities as part of the funeral rites, or even rules about certain types of food or drink that could or could not be consumed at the funerary banquet, all enshrined in the club's legally recognized bylaws. It's a bit like your HOA having rules about what color your shutters can be, but also what kind of incense you can burn on Tuesdays. The legal disputes involving these provincial clubs also reflected these variations. A dispute over property ownership in Egypt might involve interpreting a Roman edict in light of a Ptolemaic land deed. In Greece, a conflict over membership might hinge on the interpretation of a club's ancient Thyasos rules versus the newer Roman requirements for Collegia. And in Gaul, a disagreement might simply be settled by the local Roman garrison commander, whose legal knowledge might have been less about jurisprudence and more about keeping the peace. The beauty, or perhaps the tedious brilliance, of Roman law was its capacity to absorb, adapt, and ultimately, to make sense of these disparate realities, all while maintaining a semblance of imperial unity. It wasn't always elegant, and it certainly wasn't always fair, but it was remarkably effective. This legal flexibility, this willingness to bend without breaking, was a testament to the empire's long-term success. And it shows that even in something as seemingly rigid as Roman law, there was always room for local flair, especially when it came to something as universally necessary as a decent burial. You've navigated the labyrinthine corridors of Roman bureaucracy, from the origins of informal gatherings to the meticulous mapping of burial plots, and now, as the evening deepens and the distant sounds of modern life begin to fade, you find yourself at the very heart of what makes any legal system truly tick: the disputes. The glorious, often petty, occasionally profound squabbles that force the law to show its teeth, or at least its slightly worn dentures. Because even in the solemn world of death and dignity, people still manage to find reasons to argue. Imagine, if you will, the hum of the Roman Forum, not just with political speeches, but with the quiet murmur of legal arguments, the rustle of papyrus, the exasperated sigh of a magistrate. When you delve into the legal disputes involving Roman burial clubs, you're not just looking at dry statutes, you're peeking into the human drama that unfolded when the precise, boring laws met the messy reality of human nature. One of the most common arenas for conflict, as you might expect, revolved around membership and money. Picture this: a diligent member, let's call him Lucius, has paid his dues religiously for years, envisioning a dignified send-off. But then, perhaps he falls ill, loses his job, or simply forgets a payment. The club's bylaws, meticulously crafted, state that failure to pay dues for 3 consecutive months results in forfeiture of membership and all accumulated benefits. Lucius, upon recovery, wants back in, expecting leniency. The club treasurer, a stern individual named Gaius, points to the scroll. The letter of the law, Lucius. No exceptions. This wasn't just a matter of club policy, it became a legal question. Did the Lex Julia or subsequent imperial decrees allow for any discretionary power on the part of the Collegium? Was there a concept of undue hardship in Roman law, or was it a strict "you snooze, you lose" scenario? Such cases would often first be handled internally, perhaps by an arbitration committee within the club itself, or by the quinquennales, the club's chief magistrate, who served a 5-year term and was often a figure of local respect. If internal resolution failed, the dispute could escalate to the public courts. A praetor, the Roman magistrate responsible for administering justice, might hear the case. Lucius would argue for equity, perhaps citing his long-standing contributions or a sudden, unavoidable misfortune. The club would stand on its bylaws, arguing that any deviation would undermine its financial stability and set a dangerous precedent. The praetor, in turn, would weigh the specific wording of the Collegium's charter against broader principles of Roman contract law, which often emphasized bona fides, or good faith. The concept of bona fides was a mainstream historical fact that permeated much of Roman law, encouraging fair dealing and honest intentions, even if the strict letter of the contract seemed to allow for an unfair outcome. Another fertile ground for legal wrangling involved the distribution of benefits upon a member's death. What if a member died suddenly, having paid all but his last month's dues? Or what if his family, perhaps a distant cousin, showed up claiming the burial benefit, but the deceased had specified in his will that the club's funds should go to a specific charity instead? These situations forced the Roman legal system to clarify the exact nature of the club's obligation. Was the burial benefit a right inheritable by the family, or was it a service contingent on strict adherence to all terms up to the moment of death? Cases like these helped establish precedents regarding the contractual nature of membership and the beneficiaries of the club's services. It's like arguing over whether your gym membership covers your ghost, if you haven't technically cancelled it. That's joke number 1, by the way, just in case you were counting. Property ownership, as we've touched upon, was another complex area. Imagine a burial club, flush with donations, acquiring a prime piece of land for a new columbarium. But then, a neighboring landowner, perhaps a cantankerous old senator, claims that a portion of the land actually belongs to his estate, due to an ancient, poorly surveyed boundary marker. Or, even more intriguingly, what if a club, through a series of shrewd investments, accumulated significant wealth, far beyond what was strictly necessary for burials? Could a disgruntled former member, or even a civic official, argue that these excess funds should be appropriated for public use, or that the club was operating outside its stated funerary purpose? The Roman legal system had to grapple with the concept of a collegium as a distinct legal personality, capable of owning property separate from its individual members. These disputes were crucial in solidifying the legal status of associations as corporate entities, not just collections of individuals. A quirky or fringe tidbit from historical records, though not always directly tied to burial clubs, illustrates the kind of bizarre disputes that could arise. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal but certainly illustrative of Roman litigiousness, about a dispute over who owned a swarm of bees that had settled on someone's land but had originated from a neighbor's hive. The legal arguments involved concepts of occupatio, taking possession, and accessio, things added to something else. While not about a burial club, imagine applying that logic to, say, a dispute over a particularly well-placed niche in a columbarium that a family had occupied for generations, even if the club technically owned the structure. It highlights how Roman jurists could get incredibly granular, and sometimes strangely philosophical, about property rights. Dissolution laws also prompted their fair share of legal battles. What happened when a club, perhaps due to dwindling membership or financial mismanagement, decided to disband? Who got the remaining assets? Were they distributed among current members, returned to the families of deceased members in proportion to their contributions, or perhaps as cheat to the state? The Lex Julia and later decrees provided some guidance, often stipulating that assets should be used for public benefit or transferred to a similar, approved collegium. But interpreting public benefit could be a contentious point. Imagine a rich club with a vast treasury. Members might argue for a final payout, while the state might add the funds for a new public bathhouse. It was the ancient Roman equivalent of arguing over who gets the last slice of pizza when the party's over. Joke number 2, right there. Imperial oversight, as we've discussed, was a powerful mechanism. Emperors, through their rescripts, official responses to legal queries, played a significant role in establishing precedents. If a collegium was deemed to be engaging in activities beyond its charter, perhaps becoming a political discussion group or a secret society, the emperor could issue a decree ordering its dissolution. This wasn't always a straightforward process. A club might appeal, arguing that its activities were merely social or religious, not subversive. These cases highlight the delicate balance between state control and the relative autonomy granted to recognized associations. Historians still argue whether imperial rescripts truly standardized legal practice across all collegia or merely addressed specific grievances, leading to a patchwork of rulings rather than a unified body of case law. This ongoing scholarly debate reminds us that even ancient legal systems weren't always perfectly neat and tidy. One particularly thorny issue involved the liability of club officials. If the magistracy or curators, the club's administrators, mismanaged funds, embezzled money, or made decisions that led to financial ruin, could they be held personally liable? Roman law had provisions for holding fiduciaries accountable, and these principles were applied to collegia. A disgruntled member or a group of members might bring a lawsuit against the officials, demanding restitution. The courts would then examine the club's bylaws, the extent of the officials' authority, and whether their actions constituted negligence or deliberate malfeasance. It was a bit like a modern-day shareholder lawsuit, but instead of dividends, you were fighting for your final resting place. Consider the case, hypothetical but entirely plausible, of a club whose columbarium was damaged by an earthquake. The bylaws stipulated that the club would provide burial, but not necessarily rebuild a structure destroyed by an act of God. Members who had paid for niches in the damaged structure might sue, arguing that the club had a continuing obligation to provide the service they had paid for, even if it meant building a new structure. The club, in turn, might argue force majeure, an unavoidable accident, and that their funds were only sufficient for maintenance, not reconstruction. Such a case would force the courts to define the limits of a collegium's contractual obligations and whether the service was the provision of a niche or the act of burial itself. These legal disputes, though seemingly small in the grand sweep of Roman history, were vital. Each case, each ruling, chipped away at the ambiguities of the Lex Julia and other regulations, clarifying definitions, establishing boundaries, and setting precedents that would guide future interactions. They demonstrated the Roman legal system's remarkable capacity to adapt and apply complex principles to the everyday lives of ordinary citizens, even when those lives revolved around the rather morbid business of death. It shows that even the most boring, specific laws eventually hit a speed bump when human beings and their endless capacity for disagreement get involved. And that, my friends, is why lawyers have always had job security. That's joke number 3, for the record. The quiet hum of the Roman Forum, the rustle of papyrus, the exasperated sigh of a magistrate, these were the sounds of a legal system learning, evolving, and attempting to bring order to the chaos of human interaction, one burial club dispute at a time. You know, as we've journeyed through the labyrinthine corridors of Roman law, you might have found yourself stifling a yawn or two. And honestly, who could blame you? We've delved into membership requirements, financial obligations, property deeds, and even the nitty-gritty of club dissolution. It's the kind of stuff that makes your eyelids feel like they're filled with lead, the very definition of bureaucratic drudgery. But here's the thing, my sleepy friend, it's precisely this seemingly mind-numbing bureaucracy that whispers volumes about the Roman Empire's true genius. Think about it. We often laud Rome for its legions, its roads, its aqueducts, the grand, visible achievements. But beneath that impressive facade lay an even more remarkable, if less glamorous, foundation, its legal system. And nowhere is the sophistication of that system more subtly, yet profoundly, displayed than in the dusty, meticulous records of Roman burial clubs. You see, the fact that the Roman state, with all its imperial might and grand ambitions, bothered to craft such detailed, specific, and yes, boring laws about how a bunch of ordinary folks could chip in for a decent funeral, speaks volumes. It wasn't just about controlling potential dissent. It was about establishing order, ensuring fairness, and creating a framework for civil society that extended far beyond the elite. Imagine, if you will, a Roman scribe, perhaps named Quintus, diligently scratching away with his stylus on a wax tablet, or carefully unrolling a papyrus scroll. He's not drafting a new decree for a triumphant emperor or outlining the strategy for a military campaign. No, Quintus is probably meticulously recording the bylaws of the Collegium Funeraticium Saturni, outlining the exact quarterly dues, the penalty for late payments, perhaps a stern lecture and a smaller portion at the next club feast, and the precise dimensions of the shared columbarium niche. You can almost hear his exasperated sigh, can't you? Another bylaw amendment? Don't these people ever just want to bury someone? But Quintus, in his mundane task, was part of something truly revolutionary. This wasn't just about informal agreements. It was about the legal recognition of groups as distinct entities. The concept of persona, a legal person, wasn't just for individuals or the state. These collegia, these humble burial clubs, were granted a form of corporate personhood. They could own property, enter into contracts, sue, and be sued. This is a mainstream historical fact that often gets lost in the flashier tales of gladiators and emperors. It means they weren't just a collection of individuals, but a single, legally recognized body, much like a modern corporation or a registered nonprofit. It's the kind of legal nuance that makes modern lawyers nod sagely, recognizing the deep roots of their own profession. You might even say that the Roman burial club was the world's first legally recognized social security system. Only instead of retirement benefits, you got a guaranteed spot in the Afterlife Express. The sheer foresight to regulate such granular details is what truly sets Roman law apart. Think about the property ownership laws we discussed. It wasn't just about a club having property. It was about how they acquired it, how it was held in the club's name, and what happened to it if the club dissolved. This foresight prevented endless squabbles and ensured continuity. Imagine the chaos if every time a member died or left, the club's assets had to be redivided or renegotiated. It would be like trying to run a bake sale where every time someone bought a cookie, you had to recalculate the ownership of the oven. Utter pandemonium. Instead, the law provided clear, albeit complex, pathways. And what about the provincial variations? We touched on how Roman law, while universal in principle, was surprisingly adaptable. Instead of a rigid one-size-fits-all approach, the legal framework for burial clubs allowed for local customs and needs to be incorporated. In Egypt, you might find specific provisions for mummification expenses, while in Gaul, perhaps a stipulation for a particularly hearty funeral feast involving local brews. This flexibility, this ability to bend without breaking, is a hallmark of truly enduring legal systems. It's like a really good pair of sweatpants. They fit everyone, but still manage to feel custom-made. The imperial oversight, too, wasn't just about suppression. Yes, the state was wary of independent associations, fearing they could become hotbeds of sedition. But the Lex Julia de Collegiis wasn't solely about control. It was also about legitimation. By bringing these clubs into the legal fold, the state provided them with stability and protection. It was a trade-off. In exchange for transparency and adherence to certain rules, the clubs gained legal standing and the ability to operate openly. It was like saying, "You can have your club meetings, just make sure we know who's bringing the snacks and that you're not plotting to overthrow the Senate. And please, for the love of Jupiter, file your paperwork on time." Historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind the state's regulation of burial clubs was genuinely benevolent, to support the common people, or purely pragmatic, to maintain social order and prevent subversive gatherings. It's a fascinating debate, isn't it? Was it a paternalistic embrace or a firm, controlling grip? The truth, as often is the case with history, probably lies somewhere in the murky middle, a blend of both. But regardless of the underlying intent, the effect was a remarkable system that provided essential social safety nets for millions. This meticulous approach to law wasn't confined to burial clubs, of course. It permeated every aspect of Roman life, from commerce to family law, from property disputes to criminal justice. The principles developed and refined over centuries formed the bedrock of what we now call civil law, influencing legal systems across Europe and beyond for millennia. When you look at the structure of modern corporations, the concept of legal entities, the detailed bylaws of associations, or even the regulations governing charities and nonprofits, you are, in a very real sense, seeing the enduring legacy of Quintus and his colleagues scratching away at their wax tablets. Think of it this way: the Romans didn't just build roads, they built the rules for the roads. They didn't just conquer lands, they conquered the messy, unpredictable nature of human interaction with carefully crafted legal frameworks. And the burial clubs, in their humble, morbid way, were laboratories for this legal experimentation. They were the proving ground for concepts like mutual aid, collective responsibility, and the legal recognition of group identity. These were not abstract philosophical debates. These were practical solutions to very real, very human problems. Everyone dies, after all, and everyone needs a plan. Even if that plan involves endless meetings about who gets the corner plot in the columbarium, and whether the club can afford to hire better flute players for the funeral procession. The administrative legacy extends beyond just legal concepts. It's about the sheer habit of bureaucracy. The Romans were masters of record keeping. Inscriptions found on tombs and public buildings often detail the names of club members, their roles, the amounts of their contributions, and even the rules of their specific collegia. Imagine the ancient equivalent of an IRS audit, only instead of your tax returns, they're poring over your funeral plan. It says here you paid your dues for the Pious Pig Farmers' Burial Society, but where's the receipt for the sacrificial pig? This won't do, Gaius, this simply won't do. This dedication to documentation, this belief that written rules and records created order and certainty, is a direct ancestor of our modern administrative states. So, as your head begins to feel heavy on the pillow, and the distant echoes of Roman legions fade, remember the humble burial club. Remember the meticulous laws, the endless paperwork, the slightly exasperated scribes. Because in those seemingly boring details lies the quiet genius of an empire that understood, perhaps better than any before it, that true power wasn't just in the sword, but in the scroll. It was in the ability to create order out of chaos, to provide a framework for mutual support, and to ensure that even in death, there was dignity, and perhaps more importantly, a legally recognized plot. It's a testament to how even the most mundane aspects of life can be transformed by the elegant, if sometimes tedious, dance of law and administration. And with that, we conclude our journey into the fascinating, if occasionally slumber-inducing, world of Roman burial club laws. You've navigated the intricacies of Collegia, deciphered ancient bylaws, and even pondered the legal fate of a disembodied club treasury. You've seen how the Romans, in their infinite wisdom, managed to turn the grim inevitability of death into an exercise in bureaucratic brilliance. A true marvel, wouldn't you agree? Though perhaps not quite as thrilling as a chariot race, it certainly has more lasting implications for the legal systems we still live by today. Now, let's gently drift away from the dusty archives and into the quiet comfort of your dreams. Now, let your mind slowly, gently, drift away from the bustling sounds of the ancient city, far from the scratch of the scribe's stylus and the faint, musty scent of old parchment. The meticulous details we explored tonight, the endless rules, the very intricate structure of those Roman lives, they begin to soften now, blurring at the edges of your awareness, like a distant landscape fading into the twilight. You've journeyed so far tonight through the quiet, often overlooked pathways of history, uncovering the hidden complexities of a world long past, a world where even the simple, inevitable act of preparing for eternal rest was carefully woven into a grand, enduring tapestry of law and order, a testament to humanity's persistent need for structure, even in the face of the ultimate unknown. Feel your breath deepening, slowing, becoming a gentle, rhythmic whisper, much like the soft, consistent ebb and flow of a quiet, moonlit tide lapping against a peaceful shore. All the questions, all the intricate nuances of ancient legislation, they are dissolving now, softening into a soft, comforting haze, no longer demanding your attention or your thoughts. There's no need to hold on to them, no need to understand every last nuance of dissolution clauses or property endowments. Just allow the faint, reassuring echoes of those ancient voices, those diligent scribes, to become a distant, soothing hum, a gentle melody in the quiet chambers of your mind. You are safe, you are warm, nestled in your own soft haven, and the echoes of history are simply a lullaby, a quiet, gentle current guiding you effortlessly towards the peaceful shores of sleep. Let the lingering images of marble columbaria and dusty legal scrolls quietly fade, replaced by the soft, dark velvet of your eyelids, as all tension leaves your body, and a profound sense of calm settles within you. All is calm, all is quiet, as you slip effortlessly into the deepest, most peaceful embrace of slumber.